In the heart of Europe, during the 8th century, the world was changing. Vast empires were rising and falling, and kingdoms sought power, stability, and security. Among these kingdoms was the Carolingian realm, ruled by a man who would shape history for centuries to come, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. Born in 747, Charlemagne was the son of Pepin the Short and Bertrada of Leon, inheriting not just his father's crown, but the legacy of the mighty Frankish kingdom. This kingdom, which stretched across much of Western Europe, was one of the most powerful in the world at the time. But Charlemagne wasn't born to simply inherit power. He was destined to expand it, reshape it, and leave a mark on the world that would endure for centuries. As a young man, Charlemagne took up his father's mantle, ruling first in the Salian Frankish lands, and later extending his dominion to the north, south, and east. By 771, after the death of his brother Carloman, Charlemagne became the sole ruler of the Frankish kingdom. It was during this time that he would show his true strength. Charlemagne expanded his kingdom aggressively, launching a series of military campaigns that would spread his empire across modern-day France, Germany, and even parts of Italy. The region was a mix of tribal cultures and fragmented kingdoms, often battling for supremacy. The lands were plagued by constant invasions: Vikings from the north, Muslims from the south, and Slavs from the east. Charlemagne's vision was not merely to defend his people, but to unify Europe under one banner, one empire. He sought to revive the ideals of Rome, particularly the legacy of the ancient Roman Empire, which had long since crumbled. Charlemagne's military prowess was unmatched, but it wasn't just through conquest that he would leave his mark. Charlemagne understood that to rule effectively, he needed more than just an army. He needed church support, administrative reforms, and a unified cultural identity. Little did he know that in just a few short decades, he would achieve something that would forever alter the course of history: the founding of the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne was not just a warrior, he was a visionary. By the time he consolidated his rule over the Frankish territories, his ambitions stretched beyond mere conquest. He sought to create an empire that not only defended his people, but also unified the fractured lands of Europe under one ruler, and, perhaps more importantly, under one faith. Charlemagne's rise was a combination of strategic marriages, alliances, and military might. His ability to win battles was unparalleled, but his genius lay in how he used those victories to build a stronger, more centralized state. His most significant ally in this venture was the Roman Catholic Church. At the time, the Church held vast influence over the people of Europe. By aligning himself with the Pope, Charlemagne ensured his position was not just that of a king, but that of a sacred ruler. This relationship would prove crucial in shaping the future of the Holy Roman Empire. In 787, Charlemagne's rule was legitimized when Pope Adrian I crowned him as the protector of the papacy. But it was on Christmas Day, in the year 800, that Charlemagne's legacy was truly sealed. As he knelt in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III placed the crown of the Roman Emperor upon Charlemagne's head. This moment was symbolic of more than just a coronation. It marked the revival of the Roman Empire in the West. Charlemagne's reign was now sanctified, not only by his military prowess, but by the divine right granted to him by the Church. The Holy Roman Empire was born from this moment, a realm that would span centuries and see countless rulers after Charlemagne. However, Charlemagne's vision was not merely to revive Rome. It was to unite Europe under the banner of Christianity. His reign brought peace to much of the Western world, where warring tribes had once torn the continent apart. Charlemagne's empire was a realm of law, culture, and education, drawing inspiration from the classical world but infusing it with the spiritual and political power of Christianity. The emperor was now not only a secular ruler, but a protector of the faith and a man chosen by God to restore the glory of Rome. It was a bold step, one that set the stage for centuries of religious, political, and cultural development. With the coronation of Charlemagne as emperor in 800, his reign took on a new level of significance, not just militarily, but also culturally and intellectually. His empire wasn't only about land or power. It was about a revival, a renaissance of the knowledge, art, and learning of the classical world. This period is often referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance, a time when Charlemagne, alongside his advisors, sought to revive education, establish a legal framework, and reform the church. Charlemagne understood that to maintain a lasting empire, he needed more than just military might. He needed to create a sustained legacy of culture and governance. His court became a hub of learning, attracting scholars, theologians, and artists from across Europe. Alcuin of York, an English scholar, became one of Charlemagne's most trusted advisors and played a key role in this intellectual revival. It was under his guidance that Charlemagne's court witnessed the revival of the Latin language, as well as the establishment of a system of education that would shape future generations. In this new age of learning, monasteries and cathedrals became centers of knowledge, preserving ancient texts and religious manuscripts. Charlemagne's empire became a beacon of intellectual growth, creating a foundation for the future educational systems of Europe. However, Charlemagne's reforms didn't stop at the intellectual realm. He also instituted sweeping legal reforms that laid the groundwork for the governance of his vast empire. Charlemagne issued a series of capitularies, or royal decrees, that helped regulate the administration of justice, the collection of taxes, and the organization of local rule. These decrees were aimed at unifying the diverse peoples under his rule, establishing a sense of order and cohesion across his territories. The king also set his sights on reforming the church, ensuring that it was both spiritually and administratively aligned with his vision of a unified Christian empire. Charlemagne's reforms in the church, though significant, were also controversial. He sought to control church practices, curbing local abuses, and bringing greater centralization to its administration. Charlemagne believed that the church should not only serve the spiritual needs of the people, but also support the empire's political stability. By marrying education with church reforms, Charlemagne set in motion the creation of an empire that was intellectually vibrant, administratively strong, and theologically unified. It was a time when art, knowledge, and faith were intertwined, and Charlemagne's name became synonymous with the renewal of European culture. As Charlemagne's reign progressed, his empire expanded at a pace unseen in Europe for centuries. His military prowess and vision for a united Christian Europe drove his campaigns deep into Germany, Italy, and even into Spain. Through relentless conquest and strategic alliances, Charlemagne built an empire that spanned nearly all of Western Europe, a feat that had eluded many rulers before him. One of Charlemagne's most notable military achievements was his campaign against the Saxons, a fierce pagan people located in what is now modern-day Germany. For decades, the Saxons had resisted Frankish control, but Charlemagne's determination and military skill eventually overcame their resistance. Through a series of bloody campaigns, Charlemagne forced the Saxons to convert to Christianity and submit to Frankish rule, solidifying his influence over the region. The Saxon Wars, lasting from 772 to 804, were pivotal in shaping the future of the Holy Roman Empire. By forcibly integrating these lands into his empire, Charlemagne ensured a religious and political unity that extended from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Charlemagne's reach didn't stop in the north. His Italian campaigns also played a critical role in shaping the empire's future. In 800, Charlemagne was crowned king of the Lombards by Pope Leo III, further solidifying his position as a protector of the church. His military campaigns in Italy helped stabilize the region, which had long been plagued by internal strife and foreign invasions. Charlemagne's actions ensured that Rome and the papacy remained under his influence, thus fortifying the bond between the Frankish kingdom and the church. At the same time, Charlemagne expanded his influence into the Spanish March, a buffer zone between his empire and the Muslim-controlled Al-Andalus. Although his campaign into Spain was not as successful as his northern and southern campaigns, it marked the beginning of European efforts to reclaim territory from the Muslims and protect Christendom from the growing influence of Islam in the West. As Charlemagne's empire grew, so did his recognition as a unifying figure in Europe. He ruled over an empire that was not just large in size, but also deeply integrated, politically, religiously, and culturally. His conquests were not only about adding new lands to his dominion, but also about establishing a shared identity across Europe. Charlemagne envisioned a world where Christianity, law, and education intertwined to form the backbone of a unified European society. Charlemagne's death in 814 marked the end of an era. His reign, which had unified much of Western Europe, had laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the Holy Roman Empire, a complex and often fragile entity. But even Charlemagne's extraordinary legacy couldn't prevent the division and struggles that would follow after his passing. Upon Charlemagne's death, the empire was divided among his three grandsons, Louis the Pious, Charles the Bald, and Lothair. This division was not born out of conflict between the brothers, but was part of Charlemagne's attempt to provide each son with a share of the vast empire he had built. However, the decision to split the empire proved to be catastrophic. Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's designated heir, struggled to maintain control over the sprawling empire. He faced constant challenges from his sons, who sought to expand their own territories and influence, leading to civil war within the Frankish Empire. This internal strife weakened the empire, as the unity that Charlemagne had fought so hard to establish began to unravel. By the time Louis died in 840, the empire was far from the unified Christian realm that Charlemagne had envisioned. The division of the empire was formalized in 843 with the Treaty of Verdun, which split the Frankish kingdom into three separate realms. Charles the Bald received the western part of the empire, which would later become France. Louis the German received the eastern part, which would eventually become Germany. And Lothair held the central region, including Italy and the Imperial title, but his lands were surrounded by his brother's territories, leaving him in a weakened position. Though the Treaty of Verdun was meant to ensure peace, it instead set the stage for centuries of conflict. The empire would be weakened by civil war, Viking invasions, and Muslim incursions. The once mighty realm of Charlemagne would slowly fragment into smaller kingdoms, each with its own rulers and ambitions. Despite this fragmentation, Charlemagne's legacy continued to shape the future of Europe. Though the Holy Roman Empire as Charlemagne had known it no longer existed, the idea of a unified Christian empire persisted. This would lay the groundwork for the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which would emerge centuries later and survive for almost a millennium, until its dissolution in 1806. Charlemagne's dream of a unified Christian Europe may have been shattered after his death, but the vision he set in motion lived on in the hearts and minds of later rulers, theologians, and thinkers. His reign, though relatively short in the grand timeline of history, marked the beginning of the medieval. As the centuries passed since Charlemagne's death, the Holy Roman Empire faced a time of great turmoil and disunity. His vast empire had been divided among his heirs, and despite efforts to maintain the unity of the realm, it fractured into separate territories. Yet, in 962, a new chapter began, one that would mark the true reformation of the Holy Roman Empire under a new dynasty and a powerful ruler, Otto I. Otto I, also known as Otto the Great, was the first to truly consolidate the authority of the Holy Roman Empire after Charlemagne. Born into the Ludolfing dynasty in 912, Otto became king of Germany in 936, succeeding his father Henry the Fowler. Otto's reign began amidst political fragmentation and weak leadership, but his military skills and determination soon changed the course of history. His early years as king were marked by conflict, as he struggled to establish his authority over the various Germanic dukes and territories. Yet, Otto's most notable achievement would come in 962 when he was crowned emperor of the Holy Roman Empire by Pope John XII. This event, much like Charlemagne's coronation, was more than just a ceremonial title. It marked the rebirth of the idea of the Holy Roman Empire, but this time, it was centered in Germany. Otto's reign was defined by a strong, centralized rule, which contrasted sharply with the chaotic years that followed Charlemagne's death. He successfully defeated internal rebellions, expanded his territories, and even fought off invasions from the Magyars, Hungarian tribes, which helped secure his power in the region. However, Otto's rise wasn't just about military victories. It was his relationship with the Church that helped him solidify his rule. Just as Charlemagne had sought the Pope's blessing, Otto understood the importance of the Church's support. By aligning himself with the Pope, Otto was able to gain legitimacy not only in Germany, but across much of Christendom. His coronation as emperor was a testament to the continued importance of the papal connection. This alliance would play a central role throughout the empire's history, as the Holy Roman Emperors would often act as protectors of the papacy in exchange for divine validation. Otto I's reign marked the beginning of a more centralized empire, but it also set the stage for a new struggle, one between the secular power of the emperor and the religious power of the pope. Otto's success would not last without its challenges, and the stage was set for centuries of tension, as later emperors sought to navigate the complex balance between religious influence and imperial authority. Following Otto I's death in 973, the Holy Roman Empire entered a period of transition and instability, marked by the ongoing struggle for imperial authority. Otto's empire, though firmly established under his rule, was now in the hands of his successors, none of whom were able to maintain the same level of centralized control that Otto I had achieved. The early years of his successors' reigns were characterized by fragmentation and internal conflict, a pattern that would plague the empire for centuries. Otto II, who succeeded his father in 973, was faced with the challenge of defending and expanding the empire, but his reign was marred by constant challenges. Otto II's most significant achievement was his campaign in Italy, where he sought to strengthen the empire's position in the region. He engaged in multiple wars against Byzantine forces and sought to establish his own influence over the Papal States. However, despite some initial successes, Otto II's rule was short-lived. His death in 983, at the young age of 28, left the empire without strong leadership, leading to a power vacuum. The reign of Otto III, his successor, would prove even more tumultuous. Otto III, crowned emperor at the age of just 3, was initially ruled by a regency. He ascended to full power in 996, and his reign was marked by his desire to reform and strengthen the empire, especially through a renewed relationship with the Church. Otto III had lofty ambitions to re-establish the Roman Empire, seeing himself as the heir to the ancient Caesars. He sought to align the Holy Roman Empire with the ideals of Byzantium, working closely with the Pope to shape a religiously powerful empire. However, Otto III's efforts to centralize power were frustrated by the noble factions within the empire, who continued to assert their own independence and resist imperial control. The German princes and local nobility often held more power than the emperor, and their influence over regional territories further undermined Otto III's attempts to establish a truly centralized authority. His death in 1002, without a clear successor, once again left the empire in a state of uncertainty. The subsequent reign of Henry II, crowned emperor in 1014, marked a brief period of relative stability, yet the power struggle between the emperor and the nobility continued. Henry II, who had been crowned King of Germany in 1002, sought to assert control over both the empire and the church, but faced continuous challenges from rival factions within his own realm. Despite his efforts to strengthen the imperial authority, his reign did little to resolve the ongoing tensions between imperial power and noble autonomy. The internal struggles within the empire were not only political, but also deeply rooted in the question of religious authority. The Holy Roman Empire was seen as the protector of Christianity, but the growing influence of the papacy often put the emperor and the pope at odds. As the church gained more independence and power, emperors struggled to maintain control over religious matters, leading to ongoing conflict between secular rulers and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. As the Holy Roman Empire continued to evolve under its emperors, one of the greatest challenges it faced was the ever-growing power of the nobility. The empire, despite its vast territories and imperial prestige, was plagued by a persistent struggle between the emperor and the local princes, dukes, and archbishops who governed the various regions within the empire. This balance of power, or more often, the lack of it, would define much of the empire's history. By the early 11th century, the imperial authority was increasingly seen as weak and distant from the lives of the common people. While the emperors held the title of Holy Roman Emperor, much of the actual control over lands, wealth, and military might rested in the hands of the German nobility. The kingdom was divided into numerous duchies, bishoprics, and counties, each with its own ruler who often had more influence in their regions than the emperor did at the imperial court. The feudal system within the empire was the root of much of this conflict. Local lords were responsible for the governance of their territories and maintained their own armies. This decentralized structure made it increasingly difficult for emperors to enforce their will across the entirety of the empire. While some emperors attempted to impose imperial control over the local rulers, they often faced fierce resistance, especially from powerful families like the Salian dynasty and the Welfs. These noble families would often align themselves with the church or other factions, further complicating the emperor's ability to assert power. The investiture controversy was one of the most dramatic conflicts between the papacy and the imperial crown, beginning around 1075 and deeply affecting the emperor's power in the 11th century. The Cluniac reforms, which sought to restore the independence of the church from secular rulers, were gaining ground, and the papacy sought to reassert its power over the church's appointments. The emperor, traditionally responsible for the investiture, the appointment of bishops and abbots, found himself at odds with the pope. This struggle over who had the right to appoint bishops became one of the central issues in the conflict between the church and state. The church, in its growing strength, began to exert greater influence over the affairs of the empire, demanding independence and rejecting secular influence over its spiritual appointments. For emperors, the ability to control the church's leadership was crucial to their legitimacy as rulers. Without the church's blessing, an emperor's reign would be seen as incomplete or even invalid. This led to fierce confrontations, including the infamous excommunication of emperors by the pope and the emperor's retaliations, often by attempting to install their own bishops. Though emperors like Henry III sought to strengthen imperial authority, these conflicts with the nobility and the church revealed a growing weakness in the Holy Roman Empire structure. The empire's very foundation was built upon compromise. The emperor needed the support of the nobles needed the emperor for legitimacy, and both needed the church for spiritual authority. This delicate balance led to ongoing struggles for dominance between the various factions. As the empire's structure became more fragmented and the powers of the nobility continued to rise, the emperor's role shifted. While they remained the official heads of the Holy Roman Empire, their control over the vast lands they governed became more symbolic than practical. The empire, though still large and influential, was increasingly a collection of semi-autonomous regions, each ruled by a powerful local leader. By the mid-11th century, the Holy Roman Empire was entangled in one of the most defining conflicts in its history, the investiture controversy. This was a bitter dispute between the papacy and the imperial throne over the right to appoint bishops and other church officials. The clash between secular and religious authority would shape the politics of Europe for centuries and underscore the tension between the emperor's power and the growing independence of the church. The controversy began to escalate during the reign of Emperor Henry IV, 1056 to 1106, who inherited the throne at a time when the emperor's influence over the church was still considered a crucial pillar of authority. However, the church's power was on the rise, and the papacy, under Pope Gregory VII, was determined to assert its independence from secular rulers. Pope Gregory VII was a reformer at heart and sought to implement the Cluniac reforms, which aimed to eliminate corruption within the church and restore its spiritual authority, free from interference by kings or emperors. At the heart of the conflict was the issue of investiture, the act of appointing bishops and abbots. Traditionally, this was the emperor's prerogative, a way to cement his control over the church and secure loyalty from the clergy. However, Gregory VII believed that only the church should have the right to appoint its own leaders, asserting that spiritual authority could not be subject to secular control. This was a direct challenge to the emperor's authority, and when Gregory declared that only the pope could invest bishops, it set the stage for an epic showdown between the two powers. In 1075, Pope Gregory VII issued the Dictatus Papae, a papal decree that claimed the pope's authority was supreme over all secular rulers, and that only the pope could appoint bishops. This declaration was a direct attack on Henry IV's power. In response, Henry excommunicated Gregory and declared the papacy illegitimate. However, Gregory responded by excommunicating Henry, too, stripping him of his divine right to rule. This dramatic confrontation reached its peak in the infamous Walk to Canossa in 1077. Henry IV, desperate to restore his authority, made a humbling journey to the castle of Canossa in northern Italy, where Pope Gregory was staying. There, Henry stood barefoot in the snow, seeking forgiveness from the Pope, who had the power to lift his excommunication. The sight of an emperor humbled before the Pope was a powerful moment in medieval history and symbolized the Church's increasing dominance over secular rulers. Despite Henry's temporary defeat, the investiture controversy did not end there. It was a prolonged struggle, with Henry ultimately reasserting his authority in the empire. However, the Pope's victory in this battle marked a significant shift in the balance of power between the emperor and the papacy. It was clear that religious authority was on the rise, and the emperor could no longer claim uncontested control over the Church or its officials. The controversy also had lasting implications for the structure of the Holy Roman Empire. Though Henry IV regained control of the secular elements of the empire, the imperial crown's power was diminished in the eyes of the nobility. The papacy had not only asserted its spiritual superiority, but had also demonstrated the ability to interfere in the political affairs of the empire. The emperor's role as the protector of the Church was now questioned, and the secular authority of the Holy Roman Empire was increasingly seen as fragile. As the 11th century wore on, the Holy Roman Empire continued to face growing challenges, and the imperial authority continued to wane. The struggle between secular and religious powers, exemplified by the investiture controversy, had set a precedent for ongoing tensions. But perhaps even more significant was the rise of local power within the empire. As the emperors struggled to maintain control over the vast and diverse lands they ruled, regional powers, noble families, bishops, and city-states became increasingly autonomous, undermining the central authority of the emperor. The decline of imperial power was not solely the result of the conflict with the papacy. It was also the consequence of the fragmented nature of the empire itself. The Holy Roman Empire, despite its vast territories, was still a collection of semi-independent regions, each with its own local rulers. The emperor, at best, could only offer symbolic leadership in many parts of the empire, especially in regions where noble families had strong territorial control and military influence. One of the key reasons for this decentralization was the imperial system's dependence on the feudal system, which granted local lords significant autonomy over their lands. While these lords owed allegiance to the emperor, their loyalty was often superficial, and they frequently acted independently of imperial mandates. The emperor's inability to enforce his will over the nobility created a patchwork of territories where power was often held more firmly by dukes, counties, and even archbishops than by the emperor himself. In particular, the rise of powerful dynasties within the empire further fractured its unity. Families like the Salians and the Welfs played an increasingly significant role in shaping the empire's future. These noble families were often in direct competition with the emperor, seeking to expand their own influence at the expense of imperial authority. In some cases, these families even had the power to elect their own emperors, effectively making the imperial throne dependent on the approval of the nobility rather than a centralized imperial system. The Ettonian dynasty, which had brought relative stability to the empire, began to lose its grip on power as the Salians rose to prominence. The Salian emperors, such as Henry III and Henry IV, attempted to restore the power of the imperial throne, but their reigns were marked by increasing struggles with local nobility. The empire had become too large, too diverse, and too divided for any one emperor to control. This led to a gradual decentralization of political power as regional rulers, bishops, and cities began to exert greater influence over their lands. The growing power of the Church also played a crucial role in this shift. Bishops, who had once been relatively subordinate to the emperor, gained increasing autonomy as the papacy became more powerful. They controlled vast territories, both spiritual and temporal, and often found themselves in direct conflict with the emperor's secular authority. By the end of the 11th century, the emperor's role as the supreme ruler of the Holy Roman Empire was largely a formality. The actual power rested in the hands of a network of local rulers, each managing their own fiefdoms with little regard for imperial control. This fragmentation of power ultimately set the stage for the weakening of the Holy Roman Empire as a unified entity. Though the empire would continue to exist for centuries, it would be an empire in name only, a loose confederation of autonomous territories held together by an often fragile bond of fealty and tradition. The struggles of the 11th century laid the groundwork for the challenges that would face the Holy Roman Empire for the rest of its existence. The rise of local authorities, the increasing independence of the Church, and a fragmented political structure made the empire increasingly unmanageable. It would remain a patchwork of competing interests, with the emperor struggling to maintain his authority over a land that was increasingly beyond his reach. The High Middle Ages began in the wake of immense political and social transformation. The Holy Roman Empire, still reeling from internal conflicts in the previous century, was poised for both expansion and further internal strife. In 1056, the death of Henry III, the powerful and relatively stable emperor, marked the beginning of a tumultuous period in the empire's history. Henry III, who had ruled from 1039 to 1056, had effectively managed the empire, dealing with both internal disputes and external threats. His reign saw relative stability, with an emphasis on centralized power and imperial authority. However, his death left a power vacuum. His son, Henry IV, was only 6 years old when he ascended to the throne. This presented the first major challenge for the Holy Roman Empire: how to manage the reign of a child emperor in a time when the empire was anything but unified. With the young Henry IV on the throne, a regency was established, but the nobility and local princes quickly saw this as an opportunity to assert their influence. The empire, already deeply fragmented, was vulnerable to internal challenges, with powerful noble families eager to expand their own territories and influence. What followed was a period of struggles for control, particularly between the imperial throne and the local aristocracy. During this time, the Church played a significant role in the political landscape. Pope Gregory VII, who came to power shortly after Henry IV's coronation, was determined to reassert papal authority over secular rulers. His investiture controversy with Henry IV would become one of the defining struggles of the era. Pope Gregory believed that the Pope, rather than the Emperor, should hold the right to appoint bishops and have the ultimate authority over religious matters. The Church's increasing influence in both spiritual and secular matters would directly clash with the Emperor's authority, leading to a decades-long conflict that threatened to tear apart the fabric of the empire. Meanwhile, as Henry IV grew older and assumed more power, his authority was challenged not only by the Church, but by rebellious nobles. The nobles, who had grown used to exercising local control, increasingly resisted the centralized power of the emperor. The growing independence of regional rulers made it difficult for Henry IV to establish control over the entirety of the empire. The tension between the imperial authority and local powers was becoming more pronounced as the decades progressed. Although the young emperor had to contend with multiple challenges, the most significant of them all was the internal division within the empire. The nobility, empowered by the weaknesses of the imperial throne, began to expand their influence at the expense of the emperor's authority. This created a deeply fragmented empire, with political power spread across various regions, and no singular, unified vision for the empire's future. The early years of Henry IV's reign were marked by internal turmoil, none more significant than the investiture controversy, a defining conflict between the emperor and the pope that would shape the trajectory of the Holy Roman Empire and its relationship with the Church for generations. While the empire struggled with decentralization and power struggles among the nobility, the papacy saw an opportunity to reassert its supreme authority over the empire, especially in matters of spiritual and secular power. In 1075, Pope Gregory VII, who had already initiated significant reforms within the Church, issued the Dictatus Papae, a papal decree that claimed the Pope had the ultimate authority over all Christian rulers. Among the declarations was a bold claim that only the Pope could invest bishops, and that no secular ruler, including the emperor, should have any say in the appointment of church officials. This was a direct challenge to the traditional power of the emperor, who had long held the right to appoint bishops and abbots as part of his responsibility to protect the faith and maintain order in the empire. For Henry IV, this was an unacceptable threat to his power. As emperor, he had long maintained the right to invest bishops as a means of securing loyalty from his subjects, including the clergy. The church had been a vital instrument for the emperor to legitimize his rule and control vast regions of the empire. Henry's response was swift. He excommunicated Gregory VII and declared him unfit to lead the church. In turn, Pope Gregory, wielding the power of excommunication, responded by excommunicating Henry IV in 1076, absolving his subject from their loyalty to him and declaring that they were free to choose a new emperor. This excommunication sparked a crisis within the empire. As the emperor was cut off from the church's divine favor, he faced rebellion not only from the pope, but from his own nobles, many of whom sided with Gregory VII. The emperor's authority, already weakened by the growing power of regional lords, was now undermined by the moral authority of the pope. Henry IV found himself in a political and spiritual struggle that threatened the very foundations of his rule. The infamous walk to Canossa in 1077 was a pivotal moment in the investiture controversy. Faced with the threat of further rebellion and without the support of the church, Henry IV made a humbling journey to the Italian town of Canossa, where Pope Gregory was staying. There, Henry stood barefoot in the snow, seeking forgiveness from the pope. This dramatic act of penitence was meant to demonstrate his humility and willingness to submit to the pope's authority. After 3 days of waiting outside the castle, Gregory lifted the excommunication, allowing Henry to return to his throne. Despite this temporary reconciliation, the conflict between the emperor and the pope was far from over. The power struggle between secular and spiritual authorities continued for many years, even beyond the reign of Henry IV. The investiture controversy was not just a matter of appointing bishops. It was about who would hold the ultimate power in Europe. Would it be the pope, the spiritual leader of Christendom, or the emperor, who ruled as both a secular monarch and a protector of the faith? This conflict had far-reaching implications for the Holy Roman Empire. Although Henry IV temporarily restored his power, the papacy had gained a significant advantage in asserting its supreme spiritual authority. This struggle would continue throughout the Middle Ages, influencing not only the politics of the Holy Roman Empire, but also the future relationship between church and state across Europe. While the investiture controversy raged on between the emperor and the pope, another key issue within the Holy Roman Empire was emerging: the growing power of the German nobility. The tension between imperial authority and local rulers had been a persistent theme throughout the empire's history, but by the 11th and 12th centuries, the German princes, dukes, and bishops were becoming increasingly independent, further eroding the emperor's control. During the reign of Henry IV, and even more so in the years that followed, the emperor's influence was severely weakened by internal rebellion and external challenges. One of the central factors contributing to this decline in imperial power was the rise of the local nobility. The German princes, having accumulated significant wealth, land, and military strength, increasingly saw themselves as rulers in their own right, rather than vassals of the emperor. They controlled vast territories within the empire, which gave them considerable autonomy and made it difficult for any emperor to enforce their will. The power of the nobility was further consolidated as the emperor was often forced to negotiate with these regional rulers to gain their support, particularly in the face of external threats. The decentralization of power that had begun during the reign of Charlemagne was accelerating, and by the late 11th century, the emperor was often seen as a figurehead with limited authority over the day-to-day governance of the empire. One of the most significant challenges to the emperor's authority came from the rise of powerful families within the German duchies. These families, such as the Welfs and the Hohenstaufens, often controlled the crucial territories of the empire. The Welfs, for instance, were a powerful family based in Bavaria, while the Hohenstaufens held influence in the Swabian and Franconian regions. As these families grew in strength, they increasingly resisted the centralizing efforts of the emperor, often seeking to expand their own territories at the expense of imperial power. The nobility's growing influence was not just about regional autonomy. It was also about influence in imperial politics. The practice of electing emperors became more entrenched during this period. While the emperor was still formally crowned by the pope, the process of electing the emperor was increasingly dominated by the electors, a group of powerful princes and bishops who held substantial sway over the empire. This shift marked a significant departure from the idea of a divinely chosen ruler, and instead, the emperor's power was subject to the approval of the nobility. These political dynamics came to a head during the Great Interregnum, 1254 to 1273, a period in which the Holy Roman Empire was without a formal emperor, following the death of Frederick II and the subsequent failure to elect a successor. During this time, the German princes exercised even more power, as the empire's central authority crumbled. The electors, no longer constrained by an emperor's oversight, increasingly governed their territories as independent rulers, and the power of the Holy Roman Emperor was further diminished. The rise of the German nobility and the decentralization of power marked a significant shift in the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor's role, which had once been seen as the central authority in Europe, was now increasingly limited. The empire was fractured into numerous autonomous territories, each governed by its own ruler. While the emperor still held a prestigious title, the reality of governance was far more complex, as power was now more diffuse and contested among the nobility. This decentralization would set the stage for the continued fragmentation of the empire in the centuries that followed. As the German nobility gained more control, the emperor's ability to impose centralized rule became increasingly difficult, leading to a weakened imperial structure that would influence the political landscape of Europe for generations. The Crusades, which began in the late 11th century, would have a profound and lasting impact on the Holy Roman Empire. Initially, the Crusades were seen as a call to arms to defend Christendom and recapture the Holy Land from Muslim control. However, they also sparked political, social, and religious changes within Europe, particularly for the Holy Roman emperors. The First Crusade, launched in 1096 by Pope Urban II, called on Christians across Europe to take part in a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem. While the primary goal of the Crusades was to assert Christian dominance in the Holy Land, the movement also had significant political implications for the Holy Roman Empire. Pope Urban II's call to arms created a sense of unity across Christendom, but it also placed the papal authority at the center of this religious and military effort. This shift in power would be felt strongly in the empire, where the emperors had always relied on the church for legitimacy. Emperor Henry IV, still reeling from the investiture controversy, was caught in a delicate position. He had already lost significant authority to the Pope during the previous decade, and now, with the Pope calling for a crusade, the emperor's role as the protector of Christendom was further undermined. While Henry IV did not directly participate in the First Crusade, he was forced to navigate the growing influence of the papacy and the increasing independence of other Christian rulers. As the Crusades continued into the 12th century, they became a powerful tool for both the Pope and the monarchs of Europe. For some emperors, the Crusades were a way to assert their power on the international stage and enhance their standing among their peers. Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa, for example, saw the Crusades as an opportunity to expand imperial influence beyond the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1189, Frederick Barbarossa led the Third Crusade with the aim of recapturing Jerusalem. His participation in the crusade was not only a religious mission, but also an attempt to reinforce his authority as a dominant ruler in Europe. Barbarossa's leadership, however, was tragically cut short when he drowned in the Salif River in 1190, but his efforts helped cement the role of the Holy Roman Empire in the Crusades. After his death, his son Henry VI would continue the imperial support for the Crusades, though he was faced with numerous internal challenges, particularly in Italy and Sicily. Beyond the direct participation of emperors in the Crusades, the campaigns also had broader consequences for the Holy Roman Empire's internal politics. The Crusades introduced new challenges to imperial authority and power. As emperors became involved in crusading efforts, they often had to contend with regional nobles and local rulers, who used the Crusades to expand their own territories and assert their power. For example, in the Italian peninsula, the empire's hold on key territories was weakened as the papacy and local Italian rulers exploited the Crusades to establish their own autonomy from imperial control. Additionally, the Crusades brought about significant changes in trade and culture. The Mediterranean trade routes grew in importance, and cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa grew wealthy from their involvement in Crusader logistics and commerce. These trade networks would later reshape the political and economic landscape of the empire, as cities and regions gained more independence from the. As the Crusades continued, the Church's influence over European rulers deepened, and the Pope's power grew. The emperors, while still seen as protectors of the faith, found themselves increasingly challenged by the Church's increasing influence. The Pope's ability to mobilize Christian Europe for the Crusades allowed the papacy to assert its authority over secular rulers in a way that weakened the Holy Roman Empire and further fragmented imperial control. By the 12th century, the Holy Roman Empire had reached a crucial crossroads, particularly in its relationship with Italy. The emperors of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, especially Frederick I Barbarossa and his successors, sought to consolidate imperial authority in Italy, a region that had long resisted imperial control. Their campaigns and ambitions in the region would be marked by struggles that would reshape both the empire and the future of Italy. The Hohenstaufen dynasty, which took the imperial throne with Frederick I Barbarossa in 1155, was determined to reassert the emperor's power in Italy. For centuries, Italy had been a fractured region, divided between powerful city-states, the Papal States, and independent duchies. The emperors had long claimed sovereignty over Italy, but they faced constant resistance from local rulers and the papal authority, which sought to maintain its independence from the emperor's secular control. Frederick I's primary goal was to bring Italy under imperial rule and end the growing influence of the Pope and the Italian city-states, which had begun to develop their own political identities. His campaigns were not just military, but also strategic, seeking to weaken the communes, self-governing city-states, and bring them in line with imperial authority. However, his efforts were met with fierce resistance from both the Papal States and the Lombard League, an alliance of northern Italian cities that sought to preserve their independence from imperial control. Frederick's first campaign in Italy culminated in his victory at the Battle of Legnano in 1176, where the Lombard League inflicted a significant defeat on his forces. This defeat, though not a final blow to his ambitions, marked a turning point in his efforts to dominate Italy. While Frederick continued to push for imperial control, the Papal States and the growing power of the Italian communes presented an increasingly complicated challenge to the emperor's authority. The relationship between the Papal States and the emperors grew more contentious during the reign of Frederick II, Frederick I's grandson. Frederick II was crowned emperor in 1215 and sought to strengthen imperial control over both Italy and the empire at large. A brilliant and capable ruler, Frederick II was also highly ambitious. He aimed to create a unified kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily, territories that had been under Norman control before being absorbed into the empire. But his vision of imperial control in Italy was met with strong opposition from the Pope and local rulers, who saw Frederick's ambitions as a direct threat to their independence. Pope Innocent III, who had long been a staunch opponent of imperial control, excommunicated Frederick II several times, accusing him of failing to fulfill his obligations as a Christian ruler. The Pope's actions were part of a broader strategy to ensure that the papacy maintained control over Italy, a region that had long been the center of religious authority in Europe. Frederick's attempts to consolidate his power in Sicily and southern Italy were complicated by the political dynamics in the region, where local lords and towns sought autonomy and resisted imperial encroachment. The ongoing struggle for control over Italy weakened the Holy Roman Empire's influence and fragmented the political landscape of the Italian peninsula. The papacy's success in resisting imperial control over Italy contributed to the growing independence of the Italian city-states, which became more self-reliant and powerful in the centuries that followed. By the time Frederick II died in 1250, the dream of a unified imperial Italy had largely been shattered, and the Holy Roman Empire's authority over the region had been irrevocably weakened. The Hohenstaufen dynasty's efforts to assert imperial control in Italy marked a significant chapter in the history of the Holy Roman Empire. While their ambitions were not entirely realized, the legacy of their campaigns helped to shape the political and cultural development of Italy. The Papal States would continue to grow in power and influence, while the city-states of northern Italy, such as Venice, Florence, and Milan, would develop into powerful and independent political entities, laying the foundations for the later Italian Renaissance. The death of Frederick II in 1250 marked a pivotal turning point for the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick's reign had been a culmination of the Hohenstaufen dynasty's ambitious attempts to consolidate power in Italy and the empire. His death left a profound power vacuum, one that would lead to decades of instability, internal struggles, and a weakening of imperial authority. Frederick II, often regarded as one of the most enlightened and capable emperors of the Middle Ages, had spent much of his reign attempting to assert imperial control over both Italy and the larger Holy Roman Empire. His military campaigns in the south and efforts to consolidate the Kingdom of Sicily were met with resistance from the Papal States and local lords, but his intellectual prowess, political acumen, and charisma allowed him to maintain a fragile hold over the empire. His death, however, left his successors without his strong leadership, and the empire began to unravel. With no clear heir to Frederick II's empire, the Hohenstaufen dynasty was effectively weakened. The empire was already a patchwork of competing interests, with regional princes, the papacy, and various noble factions vying for power. Frederick's son, Conrad IV, attempted to maintain control, but the political landscape was rapidly shifting. Conrad's reign was short-lived, and after his death in 1254, the Hohenstaufen dynasty found itself without a clear successor. The interregnum that followed was a time of intense political fragmentation. The imperial throne became a highly contested prize, with rival factions and nobles across the empire seeking to fill the power vacuum. The German princes became increasingly influential, with many claiming the right to elect their own emperors. This period marked the beginning of the elective monarchy within the Holy Roman Empire, where the electors, the powerful German princes, were no longer bound by hereditary succession, but were free to choose the emperor from among the noble families. One of the key figures in this struggle for power was Richard of Cornwall, who was elected king of the Romans in 1257. His election was an attempt to stabilize the empire, but it was also a sign of the growing influence of the German nobility. Despite his election, Richard's rule was largely symbolic. He lacked the support of the papacy, and his influence over the fragmented empire was minimal. His reign highlighted the central problem the empire faced after Frederick's death. The emperor's ability to maintain control was now dependent on the support of the nobility, not the divine right or the strength of a central monarchy. Meanwhile, the papacy continued to assert its authority, further undermining the power of the emperor. Pope Innocent IV, who had been in conflict with Frederick II during his reign, took advantage of the emperor's weakened position by reaffirming the independence of the Papal States and challenging the imperial claim to authority over Italy. The papacy's ongoing efforts to assert its spiritual dominance were one of the many factors that further splintered the empire, as regions like Italy continued to push for more autonomy. The period following Frederick II's death is often seen as a time of disintegration for the Holy Roman Empire. What had once been a powerful and centralized empire under Frederick's rule quickly fractured into a collection of semi-independent regions, each ruled by its own prince or noble family. The imperial authority had become so diluted that the emperor was no longer seen as the supreme ruler of the empire, but rather as a figurehead dependent on the support of regional powers. In the wake of Frederick II's death, the Hohenstaufen dynasty found itself facing a growing challenge from the Welfs, one of the most powerful noble families in the Holy Roman Empire. The Welfs, who had long been rivals of the Hohenstaufens, seized the opportunity presented by the empire's instability and began to exert their influence, particularly in the election of emperors. Their rise would mark a power struggle that would shape the empire's politics for the next few decades. The Welfs were a noble family with deep roots in Germany and Italy. They had long been involved in the imperial court, but their rivalry with the Hohenstaufens went back several generations. At the heart of this conflict was the question of imperial succession. Who would control the empire in the absence of a strong, central authority? The Welfs, who held vast territories in Bavaria and Swabia, saw this moment of weakness as their chance to take control. In 1257, the German princes elected Richard of Cornwall as king of the Romans, but his reign was largely ineffective due to his lack of support from the papacy and the internal divisions within the empire. In the same year, the Welf family secured the election of Alfonso X of Castile, who had the backing of several powerful princes and nobles. This election, though not universally accepted, was a significant blow to the Hohenstaufens, as it marked the emergence of the Welfs as a key rival power within the empire. The conflict between the Hohenstaufen and the Welfs would not be resolved easily. The two families had a deep-seated personal rivalry, but their conflict also represented a broader struggle for control of the empire. The Welfs were determined to undermine the influence of the Hohenstaufens, and they leveraged the fragmented nature of the empire to their advantage. Their power, particularly in the southern regions of the Holy Roman Empire, gave them considerable leverage in the imperial election process. One of the most significant moments in this power struggle came in the Battle of 1266, when Ottokar II of Bohemia, a strong supporter of the Welfs, defeated Richard of Cornwall and his allies in a key confrontation. This victory further solidified the Welfs' position within the empire and revealed the extent to which imperial power had become a game of political alliances and regional dominance. The Welfs also had the support of the papacy, which had long been in opposition to the Hohenstaufens, particularly after their conflict with Frederick II. The papacy viewed the Welfs as a means to undermine the Hohenstaufen and regain influence over the Holy Roman Empire. In the eyes of the Church, the Hohenstaufens had been too ambitious, too independent, and too willing to challenge papal authority. The Welfs, by contrast, were seen as more amenable to papal control, and the papacy often offered them support in their bid for imperial power. Despite these setbacks, the Hohenstaufen family continued to maintain some support among certain factions of the nobility, especially in southern Germany and Italy. They were not easily defeated, and their persistence would ensure that the struggle for the imperial throne remained fierce and unresolved for many years. The Hohenstaufen-Welf conflict would continue to shape the political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire, influencing the way the empire was governed for the rest of the century. Following the death of Frederick II and the subsequent struggles between the Hohenstaufen and the Welfs, the Holy Roman Empire entered into a period of interregnum, a time in which the empire was left without a strong central ruler. The interregnum lasted from 1254 until the election of Rudolf of Habsburg in 1273, during which time the empire became increasingly fragmented, and its power was significantly diminished. This period marked a pivotal moment in the history of the empire, as it revealed the weakening of imperial authority and the rise of local power. The interregnum began after the death of Conrad IV, the last male heir of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, in 1254. With no clear successor, the empire was thrown into chaos. The German princes, previously loyal to the emperor, now sought to assert their own power and influence. Without a strong emperor to maintain unity, these local rulers were free to act in their own interests, often at the expense of imperial control. During this time, the elective monarchy became more prominent. The practice of electing the emperor was not new, but in the absence of a hereditary monarch, the electoral process became a means by which powerful princes could gain control of the empire. However, this system was deeply fragmented, as the empire's vast territories were controlled by a patchwork of rival families and factions. The electors, who were typically powerful German princes and bishops, no longer viewed the emperor as an absolute ruler, but rather as a figurehead who could be elected and removed based on political convenience. One of the most significant outcomes of the interregnum was the growing influence of the local nobility. Regional powers, such as the Lombard cities in northern Italy and the Bohemian kings, began to assert their autonomy, further weakening the already fragile central authority of the emperor. These regional rulers were more interested in maintaining their independence than in preserving the unity of the empire. The papacy also played a key role during the interregnum, aligning itself with various factions to maintain its influence in Italy and throughout the empire. With the Hohenstaufens in decline, the Pope sought to assert its authority over the empire's affairs, particularly in the northern Italian territories. The papacy's involvement in imperial politics during the interregnum further complicated the situation, as the papacy had its own agenda of limiting secular power and increasing the Church's dominance. In this fractured environment, the empire's control over its Italian territories, particularly Sicily and the Papal States, became increasingly tenuous. Various factions in Italy, from the Guelphs, supporters of the Pope, to the Ghibellines, supporters of the emperor, fought for control, leading to prolonged conflict and instability in the region. The electoral system that emerged during the interregnum was a direct consequence of the empire's decentralization. The German princes began to act more as independent rulers rather than part of a unified imperial structure. The lack of a central imperial authority allowed the local rulers to fortify their own positions, making it difficult for any single emperor to reassert full control over the empire. Ultimately, the interregnum highlighted the decline of the Hohenstaufen dynasty and the fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire. It became clear that the idea of a unified empire, governed by a single emperor, was increasingly unfeasible. Regional autonomy and the growing power of local nobility would continue to define the political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries to come. As the Holy Roman Empire languished in its interregnum, with no strong central ruler to guide its fragmented states, a new power was quietly emerging in the empire. This power would soon take the reins of the empire and steer it in a new direction. The Habsburgs, a powerful noble family from the region of Swabia, began to rise to prominence in the late 13th century, positioning themselves as key players in the struggle for imperial authority. The Habsburgs had long been influential in the empire, but it was during the interregnum that they began to strategically position themselves for the imperial throne. Rudolf of Habsburg, the family's most ambitious figure, was a key player in this process. Born into a lesser noble family, Rudolf initially had little in the way of wealth or territorial holdings. However, his political acumen, strategic alliances, and ability to garner support among the German princes set him on a path toward greater power. During the interregnum, the empire's political structure was chaotic, with no emperor to stabilize it. The German electors, who held the power to choose the emperor, were divided. With the Hohenstaufen dynasty in decline and the Welfs lacking the strength to assert control, many of the electors found themselves looking for a new candidate. Rudolf's key advantage was his ability to unite various factions within the empire and gain the backing of influential electors. In 1273, after nearly 2 decades of instability, the German electors finally chose Rudolf as emperor. His election was the result of careful maneuvering. He was seen as a compromise candidate who could balance the interests of various factions within the empire. Rudolf's support came not just from the German princes, but also from the Papal States, which had a vested interest in restoring some level of imperial stability. Upon his election as Rudolf I of the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs were catapulted into the spotlight. Rudolf's rise to the throne represented the beginning of a new era for the empire, as the Habsburg family would dominate the imperial throne for centuries to come. Rudolf's reign, however, would be marked by the same internal struggles that had plagued his predecessors. While he was seen as a unifying figure, the empire's fragmentation remained a serious problem. One of Rudolf's primary challenges was to restore imperial authority in the face of powerful local nobility, who had grown accustomed to independence during the interregnum. The empire, still divided among numerous regions and ruled by various princes, was difficult to govern. Although Rudolf's election helped stabilize the empire to some degree, it did little to resolve the underlying tensions between the emperor and the powerful local dukes and electors. Rudolf also faced the daunting task of asserting control over Italy, which had remained largely autonomous and under the control of the Papal States. The Italian city-states were deeply divided, and papal opposition to imperial authority was fierce. For much of his reign, Rudolf found himself unable to make significant inroads in Italy, where the papacy continued to hold considerable sway. However, what Rudolf lacked in territorial expansion, he made up for in diplomacy and political strategy. He worked to consolidate his power by securing territorial acquisitions through marriages and alliances. Over the course of his reign, he managed to expand Habsburg influence in regions such as Austria, Switzerland, and Burgundy, laying the foundation for the Habsburg dynasty's future dominance in European politics. The Habsburg dynasty began its monumental rise to power with the election of Rudolf I in 1273. His ascent to the imperial throne marked a crucial shift in the balance of power within the Holy Roman Empire, as the Habsburgs would go on to dominate European politics for centuries. But Rudolf's path to the throne was not a smooth one, and his reign, while foundational, faced immense challenges. Before his election, the empire had been mired in instability following the interregnum, (1254 to 1273), a period without a central ruler after the fall of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. This created a power vacuum that was filled by competing noble factions, including the Welfs, Lombard cities, and powerful German princes. The election of Rudolf I in 1273 came at a time when the empire was deeply fragmented, and many saw him as a compromise candidate who could unite the warring factions. Rudolf I was a relatively unassuming figure in comparison to his predecessors. Born into the relatively minor Habsburg family, he did not have the vast territorial holdings of the powerful German princes. What Rudolf lacked in wealth and influence, however, he more than made up for in political savvy, diplomacy, and the ability to form key alliances. His ascent to power was largely thanks to his ability to secure the support of the electors, the princes who had the power to choose the emperor. Once crowned, Rudolf sought to restore imperial authority and stabilize the empire. One of his first acts as emperor was to gain control over the territories in Switzerland and Austria, regions that had been fragmented and resisted centralized control. He secured the Austrian duchies, including Styria, Carinthia, and Tyrol, establishing a strong Habsburg presence in the heart of Europe. These acquisitions would serve as the foundation for the Habsburgs' growing influence over the coming centuries. Despite these early successes, Rudolf faced significant challenges. One of his most pressing issues was the growing power of the local nobility. The German princes, who had enjoyed substantial autonomy during the interregnum, were reluctant to give up their newfound independence. Rudolf, however, used a combination of diplomatic negotiations and military force to bring them into line, establishing a fragile balance of power within the empire. Rudolf also had to navigate the complex relationship with the Papal States. The Pope had traditionally played a key role in imperial politics, and as emperor, Rudolf sought to maintain a delicate balance between asserting his authority over the Holy Roman Empire while respecting the spiritual authority of the papacy. However, the papacy's increasing involvement in secular politics posed a significant challenge to the emperor's power, and this would continue to shape the relationship between the Habsburgs and the papacy throughout their rule. Despite these challenges, Rudolf I's reign laid the groundwork for the Habsburg family's dominance in European politics. His ability to secure important territorial acquisitions and form strategic alliances strengthened the Habsburg position, and his legacy would shape the future of the Holy Roman Empire. Rudolf's success in consolidating power would prove critical, as the Habsburgs would go on to play a central role in the empire and beyond for centuries to come. Following his election as emperor in 1273, Rudolf I embarked on a mission to secure his family's power and influence within the Holy Roman Empire. While his early reign helped stabilize the empire, the challenges of ruling over a fragmented realm were immense. To solidify his legacy and expand the Habsburg holdings, Rudolf sought to strengthen his dynasty's territorial grip through strategic marriages, military alliances, and territorial conquests. One of Rudolf's first major moves was to focus on consolidating control over Austria, which had been a contested region in the empire for years. The Babenbergs, who had ruled the region, were dying out, and this presented a unique opportunity for the Habsburgs. Rudolf, through both negotiation and marriage, managed to secure the Duchy of Austria in 1278. This acquisition significantly boosted the Habsburgs' power base, granting them control over one of the most strategically important regions of the empire. Rudolf's territorial expansion didn't stop at Austria. He also sought to increase the Habsburgs' influence in Switzerland and southern Germany, regions that had long been independent and fiercely resistant to imperial control. His success in securing Austria gave the Habsburgs a solid territorial foundation, allowing them to extend their influence across the Holy Roman Empire. Rudolf's reign was not without conflict. The German princes, who had grown accustomed to the autonomy they had enjoyed during the interregnum, were often resistant to the emperor's centralizing policies. Rudolf's efforts to centralize imperial power were met with fierce opposition, especially from regional dukes and electors, who were reluctant to lose their power. The tensions between the emperor and the local nobility were exacerbated by the fact that Rudolf's family had no significant military strength or financial resources to impose their will across the vast empire. Despite these difficulties, Rudolf's approach to diplomacy was crucial in securing his position. He formed strategic marriages with other powerful noble families, cementing his alliances with key players in the empire. Notably, his son, Albert I, would go on to inherit the Duchy of Austria, cementing the Habsburgs' control over the region and establishing the Austrian branch of the family. These marriage alliances would prove instrumental in further expanding Habsburg influence, laying the groundwork for future territorial acquisitions in Central and Eastern Europe. The growing influence of the Habsburgs wasn't just confined to territorial control. Rudolf also recognized the importance of securing the support of the Church. The papacy had traditionally been a powerful player in imperial politics, and as emperor, Rudolf sought to balance the secular and spiritual authorities. His relationship with the papacy was generally positive, as he sought to maintain peace with the Church while expanding his own power. This careful diplomacy would be a hallmark of Habsburg politics in the years to come, allowing the family to thrive in an empire marked by complex religious and political divisions. However, despite these early successes, Rudolf's reign was not without its challenges. His later years were plagued by internal strife, and the imperial crown became increasingly contested as the Habsburgs' growing power threatened the balance within the Holy Roman Empire. The question of who could effectively control the empire, the emperor, the papacy, or the local nobility, was far from settled. After Rudolf I's death in 1291, the Habsburg dynasty faced significant challenges in maintaining its influence and authority within the Holy Roman Empire. While Rudolf's acquisition of Austria and consolidation of power laid a strong foundation for the Habsburgs, his death left a complex political landscape for his son and successor, Albert I. Albert's reign, 1298 to 1308, was marked by internal strife, power struggles with the German princes, and the continued efforts to strengthen Habsburg control over the empire. Albert I, despite being crowned as King of the Romans in 1298, faced considerable opposition, particularly from the powerful Welf family and other rival factions within the empire. His election to the throne was contested, and he had to navigate a fractured political environment. Albert's primary challenge was to solidify his authority, which was often undermined by the powerful German princes, many of whom had grown accustomed to the autonomy they enjoyed during the interregnum. One of Albert's key actions to assert his authority was his attempt to centralize power and curb the growing independence of the local nobility. The princes and nobles had traditionally held significant influence over their territories, and Albert's efforts to assert control over these regions led to a series of confrontations with local rulers. However, his attempts to assert imperial authority were met with resistance, as the German princes were reluctant to cede their autonomy. In 1300, Albert's conflict with the Welfs came to a head when he attempted to consolidate control over the Duchy of Bavaria. This move led to a bitter struggle with Louis of Wittelsbach, a rival claimant to the Bavarian throne. Albert's efforts to control Bavaria were unsuccessful, and the conflict further fragmented the empire, highlighting the deep divisions between the emperor and the regional nobility. Despite this, Albert remained determined to secure his family's position. Albert's reign also saw significant tension with the papacy. The growing power of the Church and the papacy's involvement in imperial politics presented a constant challenge for the emperor. Albert, like his father, sought to maintain a delicate balance between asserting imperial authority and ensuring that the Church did not undermine his rule. However, the papacy increasingly viewed the emperor as a rival for power, especially in matters related to the appointment of bishops and control over Italian territories. The turning point of Albert's reign came in 1308, when he was assassinated by his nephew, John of Swabia, in a political conspiracy that reflected the instability and growing tensions within the empire. Albert's death left the Habsburgs in a precarious position, as his son, Frederick the Fair, was unable to secure his position as emperor immediately. This assassination marked a turning point for the Habsburg family, as it signified the fragility of imperial power and the vulnerability of the monarchy in the face of powerful and independent regional factions. Despite the setbacks during Albert's reign, the Habsburg family would not give up its ambitions. The Habsburgs had already established a powerful base in Austria, and they continued to strengthen their control over the region, using both marriage alliances and territorial expansion as tools to secure their influence. Albert's son, Frederick the Fair, would eventually ascend to the throne in 1314, but his reign would be marked by continued internal conflict and the growing dominance of the local nobility. Albert's reign, though troubled, played a crucial role in the Habsburg dynasty's journey toward dominance. His efforts to centralize power and expand Habsburg influence in Bavaria and Italy set the stage for future generations of Habsburg rulers who would use a combination of diplomacy, marriage, and military conquest to continue their rise to prominence. Following the assassination of Albert I in 1308, the Habsburg dynasty faced yet another crisis of legitimacy. Albert's death, brought about by a political conspiracy orchestrated by his own nephew, John of Swabia, destabilized the empire and left the Habsburgs in a weakened position. Albert's son, Frederick the Fair, found himself thrust into a bitter struggle to claim the imperial throne, facing opposition not only from rival factions within the empire, but also from competing claimants to the throne. Frederick's path to the throne was complicated. He had the support of his father's former allies and the Habsburg territories in Austria, but his claim to the Holy Roman Empire was far from secure. In 1314, the electors of the empire were divided between two candidates, Frederick the Fair, backed by the Habsburgs, and Louis IV of Bavaria, a powerful rival. The election was bitterly contested, and both sides sought to assert their legitimacy through alliances, diplomacy, and military force. The conflict between Frederick and Louis became known as the First War of the Bavarian Succession, and it highlighted the fragmentation of the empire during this period. The electors, who had previously been able to elect the emperor, now found themselves deeply divided, with some backing Louis IV, who had the support of the Bavarian nobility, and others supporting Frederick the Fair. The rivalry between the two candidates ultimately led to a civil war within the empire, weakening the central authority even further. Frederick the Fair was eventually crowned emperor, but his reign was marked by ongoing struggles to solidify his power. Louis IV, despite being excommunicated by the papacy, managed to secure the loyalty of many of the German princes, and his reign would prove to be more successful in asserting imperial authority. Frederick, however, faced continued opposition from local nobility and Bavarian forces, which undermined his efforts to unify the empire. One of Frederick's key challenges was his relationship with the papacy. The papacy, led by Pope John XXI, had long been a powerful force in imperial politics, and Frederick's reign saw increasing tension between the emperor and the pope. The papacy, as it had in the past, sought to assert its authority over the emperor, particularly in matters related to the investiture of bishops and the control over church lands in Italy. The growing papal interference in secular matters led to a prolonged conflict between Frederick and the pope, further complicating Frederick's rule. Despite his struggles, Frederick's reign was not without successes. He successfully expanded Habsburg territories, particularly in Austria, and worked to strengthen the family's political and economic power. However, the constant power struggle with Louis IV and the papacy drained his resources and undermined his ability to secure long-term stability for the empire. Frederick's reign also highlighted the growing weakness of imperial authority in the face of powerful regional rulers and external threats. Frederick's challenge to Louis IV and the papacy marked a critical moment in the Habsburg rise. Although he was ultimately unable to secure a lasting grip on the imperial throne, his reign helped solidify the Habsburgs' place in European politics. His efforts to expand Habsburg territories and forge alliances with powerful noble families laid the groundwork for future Habsburg rulers, who would continue to use similar tactics to expand their influence across Europe in the centuries to come. As the Habsburgs solidified their grip on power in the Holy Roman Empire during the late 13th and early 14th centuries, they faced a persistent and ongoing struggle to assert control over Italy, a region that had long been a hotbed of political, religious, and territorial conflicts. Despite their central position in the empire, the Habsburgs faced fierce competition from powerful Italian city-states, the papacy, and competing dynasties, all of which sought to control key territories in the peninsula. Italy, at this time, was a fragmented collection of independent city-states and regions, many of which had long-standing rivalries. The Papal States, led by the Pope, controlled large swaths of central Italy, including Rome, while other territories such as Milan, Naples, and Florence were ruled by influential families or republics. The Habsburgs' involvement in Italian politics was largely driven by the desire to assert their dominance in the region and to weaken the influence of their rivals. Frederick II, the Hohenstaufen emperor, had made ambitious attempts to control Italy, but by the time of Rudolf I's ascension to the throne, the Habsburgs were still unable to assert full authority over the peninsula. During the reign of Albert I, however, the Habsburgs began to focus more directly on expanding their influence into Italy, primarily through marriage alliances and territorial acquisitions. In 1314, the Habsburgs gained their first significant foothold in Italy through the election of Frederick the Fair as emperor. His reign, though marked by internal strife and political struggles with the Bavarians and the papacy, nevertheless allowed the Habsburgs to establish a more consistent presence in Austria and southern Germany. However, Frederick's efforts to claim control over northern Italy, particularly in Milan and Florence, were met with strong resistance from local powers and the papacy. The Pope, in particular, viewed the imperial influence in Italy as a direct threat to the Church's authority. The Habsburg struggle for dominance in Italy became increasingly defined by their rivalry with the Visconti family, rulers of Milan. The Viscontis, one of the most powerful families in northern Italy, had long sought to expand their control in the region, and their interests often clashed with the Habsburgs. Milan's strategic location and wealth made it a key target for any would-be rulers in northern Italy. The Habsburgs sought to counterbalance the Visconti's growing power by attempting to gain political and military influence over Milan. Despite these efforts, the Habsburgs' attempts to dominate Italy were often unsuccessful in the face of local resistance. Italian city-states and territories like Venice and Florence maintained their independence, sometimes aligning themselves with the papacy to resist imperial influence. The Papal States, especially under popes like John XXI and Innocent VI, maintained a strong opposition to Habsburg influence, particularly in central Italy. In addition to the papacy, the Habsburgs' territorial ambitions were complicated by the growing influence of Naples, which was ruled by the Anjou family. The Anjou's presence in southern Italy directly challenged Habsburg control and contributed to the fragmentation of imperial influence across the region. These political and military rivalries defined the Habsburg struggle for control of Italy during this period. Despite the Habsburgs' inability to fully dominate Italy during the 14th century, their influence in the region would lay the foundation for future Habsburg rulers. The marriage alliances, particularly with powerful families in Burgundy, Spain, and Bohemia, would set the stage for the dynastic expansion of the Habsburgs across Europe in the coming centuries. The Habsburgs' control of Austria and their growing wealth and influence allowed them to continue vying for power in Italy, even as local rulers and the papacy maintained their resistance. By the early 15th century, the Habsburg dynasty had firmly established itself as a dominant force within the Holy Roman Empire. However, it was not until the reign of Maximilian I, 1493 to 1519, that the Habsburgs truly became a leading power in Europe, thanks in part to a series of strategic alliances, military campaigns, and territorial expansions that would shape the course of European history for centuries to come. Maximilian I's reign was a transformative period for the Habsburgs, as he sought to strengthen the dynasty's control over the empire and expand Habsburg territories beyond the traditional boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire. Maximilian's vision was to create a European power base for the Habsburgs by consolidating their influence in both Central Europe and beyond. One of Maximilian's most significant achievements was his marriage to Mary of Burgundy in 1477, a union that brought the Habsburgs control over the wealthy and strategically important lands of Burgundy, including the Netherlands, Franche-Comté, and parts of modern-day France. This marriage was not just a political alliance. It was a dynastic maneuver that allowed the Habsburgs to establish a dominant presence in Western Europe. Maximilian's marriage to Mary of Burgundy also set the stage for the future Habsburg domination of the Low Countries, which would remain under Habsburg rule for centuries. Maximilian also secured the Spanish crown through the marriage of his son, Philip the Handsome, to Joanna of Castile in 1496. This marriage further expanded Habsburg influence, as it linked the Habsburgs to the powerful Spanish monarchy. The union of the Spanish and Habsburg crowns laid the foundation for the Habsburg-Spanish alliance that would dominate European politics in the 16th century, especially under the reign of Charles V, Maximilian's grandson. Maximilian's reign was also marked by his efforts to reform the Holy Roman Empire. He attempted to centralize imperial power, reduce the influence of local princes, and strengthen the imperial authority over the various regions of the empire. His reforms, while not entirely successful, were important steps toward creating a more unified and centralized Habsburg monarchy. Maximilian also worked to increase the prestige of the imperial crown by securing imperial recognition from the papacy and solidifying the Habsburg family's position as the leading European dynasty. Maximilian's military campaigns further contributed to the Habsburgs' expanding influence. His campaigns against France and Venice helped to secure Habsburg holdings in Italy and southern Europe. Although not always successful, these campaigns demonstrated the Habsburgs' growing military prowess and their willingness to assert their dominance on the European stage. The early 16th century was a time of great upheaval for the Holy Roman Empire and much of Europe. A period of religious and political transformation was set in motion by the actions of one man, Martin Luther, whose challenge to the Catholic Church would ignite a revolution that would reverberate through Europe for generations to come. The Reformation was not simply a theological dispute. It was a movement that reshaped the very fabric of society, politics, and religion across Europe. In 1517, Martin Luther, a German monk and theologian, famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, a symbolic act that would signal the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Luther's 95 Theses criticized the Church's practice of selling indulgences, a form of pardon for sins that could be bought, effectively reducing the significance of true repentance. He argued that salvation was a gift from God, received through faith alone, rather than something that could be bought or earned through works or indulgences. Luther's criticism of the Catholic Church was based on his deep convictions about the authority of Scripture. He believed that the Bible should be the ultimate source of religious truth, not the papacy or church tradition. His doctrine of sola scriptura, Scripture alone, challenged the established order of the Catholic Church, which had long maintained authority over religious interpretation and practice. Luther's insistence on the primacy of the Bible would become one of the key tenets of the emerging Protestant faith. Luther's writings quickly spread across Europe, aided by the newly invented printing press, which allowed his ideas to reach a far wider audience than was previously possible. His ideas resonated with many who were dissatisfied with the Church's corruption and abuses. For decades, the Catholic Church had been mired in scandals, including the sale of indulgences, the lavish lifestyles of the clergy, and the perceived moral decay of the papacy. Luther's critique of these practices gave voice to widespread discontent, particularly in Germany, where the desire for reform was growing. The Catholic Church responded harshly to Luther's challenge. In 1521, Luther was excommunicated by Pope Leo X and called to appear before the Diet of Worms, a council of church and imperial leaders, where he was asked to recant his teachings. Luther famously refused, declaring, "Here I stand, I can do no other," asserting his belief that his conscience was bound to God's word alone. His defiance marked a turning point in the religious landscape of Europe. Luther's excommunication only fueled the fire of reform. Support for Luther's ideas grew among many German princes, who saw his challenge to the papacy as an opportunity to assert their own political independence from the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. The rise of Lutheranism, particularly in Germany, would later play a key role in the formation of Protestant states and the eventual fragmentation of religious unity in Europe. While Luther's influence was immense, he was not the only figure to challenge the Catholic Church. The Reformation sparked a wave of religious unrest across Europe, leading to the rise of various Protestant sects, such as the Zwinglians in Switzerland, the Calvinists in France and the Netherlands, and the Anglicans in England. These movements, each with their own variations of Protestant theology, further fragmented Christian unity. The early 16th century thus marked the beginning of a profound shift in the religious, social, and political order of Europe. Luther's defiance of the Church sparked the Protestant Reformation, which would result in widespread religious conflict, the formation of new religious communities, and a lasting impact on the political and cultural landscape of Europe. The Catholic Church, in turn, would initiate its own Counter-Reformation, seeking to reaffirm its authority and stem the tide of Protestantism. The Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther's defiant 95 Theses in 1517, quickly spread across Germany and beyond, transforming the religious landscape of Europe. Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church set off a chain reaction, with reformers in various regions taking up his call for religious, political, and social change. As Lutheranism spread across Europe, it not only divided the Church, but also fractured Europe along religious lines, leading to decades of religious wars and political unrest. One of the key factors that allowed the spread of Lutheranism was the invention of the printing press. This revolutionary technology, introduced by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, enabled Luther's writings to reach a far wider audience than ever before. Pamphlets, books, and sermons, all conveying Luther's critique of the Catholic Church, were printed and disseminated widely. Within a few years, Luther's ideas had spread from Germany to Switzerland, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and beyond, gaining followers who were disillusioned by the corruption and perceived abuses within the Catholic Church. The spread of Lutheranism also found strong support among German princes. Many saw Luther's reforms as an opportunity to assert their independence from both the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor, who had long wielded significant influence over their territories. By aligning with Luther, these princes could gain both religious legitimacy and political autonomy. The German princes' support was crucial in protecting Luther and his followers from persecution, particularly after Luther's excommunication in 1521. The Peace of Augsburg, 1555, which allowed princes to choose the religion of their territories, either Lutheranism or Catholicism, was a direct result of the powerful political role these princes played in the Reformation. However, the spread of Lutheranism was not without significant resistance. The Catholic Church responded strongly to the Reformation, launching the Counter-Reformation, a series of reforms within the Church aimed at addressing the criticisms raised by reformers like Luther. Led by figures such as Pope Paul III and the Jesuit order, the Counter-Reformation sought to reaffirm Catholic doctrine, eliminate corruption, and stop the spread of Protestantism. As Lutheranism spread, other Protestant movements emerged, further splintering the religious landscape. John Calvin in Switzerland and John Knox in Scotland established their own branches of Protestantism, each with distinctive theological ideas. Calvinism, with its emphasis on the sovereignty of God, predestination, and a strict moral code, became particularly influential in France, the Netherlands, and Scotland. These different Protestant groups often clashed with each other, creating even more religious division. The rise of Protestantism led directly to the wars of religion in Europe, which would dominate much of the 16th and early 17th centuries. One of the earliest and most significant conflicts was the German Peasants' War, 1524 to 1525, where Protestant peasants, inspired by Luther's message of spiritual equality, sought to overthrow the feudal system and gain freedom from their lords. However, Luther himself distanced himself from the peasants, fearing that their rebellion would weaken his movement. The war ended in a bloody defeat for the peasants, but it highlighted the deep social and political tensions that accompanied the Reformation. As Lutheranism spread throughout Germany, the Habsburg dynasty, under Charles V, sought to maintain Catholic orthodoxy and imperial control. Charles V, who ruled over a vast European empire that included Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and much of Italy, viewed the Reformation as a threat to his authority and the unity of his empire. He attempted to suppress the Protestant movement through both political and military means, leading to the Schmalkaldic War, 1546 to 1547, between Protestant princes and the imperial forces. Though Charles was victorious, the conflict only temporarily suppressed the spread of Protestantism. The Peace of Augsburg, 1555, which allowed each prince to choose the religion of their territory, effectively legalized Lutheranism within the Holy Roman Empire. As the Reformation unfolded across Europe, religious and political tensions escalated. The split between Catholicism and Protestantism was no longer merely a theological issue. It had become a matter of political survival. European rulers now had to navigate a world in which religious affiliation determined not just spiritual identity, but also political allegiance. This division set the stage for a series of religious wars, particularly in France, the Netherlands, and England, as Catholics and Protestants sought to dominate the political landscape of Europe. By the early 17th century, the Reformation had profoundly reshaped Europe, not just in religious terms, but also in political, social, and military spheres. The deep divisions between Catholics and Protestants sparked a series of religious wars that would culminate in one of the bloodiest and most destructive conflicts in European history, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. The 30 Years' War was primarily fought in the Holy Roman Empire, although its effects would spread across Europe. The war was rooted in the religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants that had been building since the early days of the Reformation. But as the conflict progressed, it became less about theology and more about political power, with various European powers using the war as a vehicle to further their own territorial and dynastic ambitions. The war began with the Bohemian Revolt in 1618, when Protestant nobles in the Kingdom of Bohemia, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire, rose up against the Catholic Habsburg ruler, Ferdinand II. Ferdinand, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor, had attempted to enforce Catholic orthodoxy within his empire, provoking anger among Protestant groups. The conflict started with the defenestration of Prague, in which 2 Catholic officials were thrown out of a window by Protestant nobles. This dramatic event ignited a wider conflict that would evolve into a full-blown religious and political struggle. Initially, the war was primarily a struggle between Catholic forces, supported by the Habsburgs, and Protestant forces, led by German princes and supported by external allies such as Sweden and France. However, as the war progressed, it became clear that the battle for religious dominance was intertwined with struggles for territorial control. France, despite being a Catholic nation, sided with the Protestant powers, seeking to weaken the Habsburgs, who controlled both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. This alliance of political convenience highlighted the increasingly complex nature of the conflict, where religion and politics were inseparable. The Swedes, led by Gustavus Adolphus, played a crucial role in the Protestant cause. Gustavus Adolphus was a brilliant military strategist, and his forces scored several key victories over the Catholic Habsburgs. His involvement not only shifted the momentum in favor of the Protestants, but also introduced new tactics and innovations in warfare, such as the use of mobile artillery and organized infantry, that would influence military campaigns for centuries. However, despite these successes, the war had devastating consequences for the Holy Roman Empire. The conflict destroyed much of Central Europe, leaving millions dead from battle, famine, and disease. The empire's political structure weakened as various regions increasingly sought to assert their independence, and the once powerful authority of the emperor was significantly undermined. The war became less about religious ideology and more about the struggle for political and territorial dominance between the Habsburgs, the French, the Swedes, and various German states. The war finally ended with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which brought a fragile peace to Europe. The treaty recognized the sovereignty of the German princes and granted them the right to determine the religion of their territories, effectively ending the religious unity of the Holy Roman Empire. The treaty also marked the decline of Habsburg power in Central Europe and the rise of France as the dominant European power. The German states were left fragmented, with a weakened Holy Roman Emperor and a divided religious landscape. The 30 Years' War had far-reaching consequences for Europe. It severely altered the political and religious map of the continent, cementing the division between Catholics and Protestants and paving the way for the rise of secularism in European politics. It also signaled the decline of the medieval imperial order and the rise of nation-states as the primary political entities in Europe. The war was one of the deadliest and most destructive conflicts in European history, and its legacy would shape the course of European politics for centuries to come. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, had profound and lasting effects on the Holy Roman Empire. While the war itself was a devastating conflict, it also marked the beginning of a period of imperial decline. The Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, which ended the war, had significant consequences for the structure of the Holy Roman Empire. It formally recognized the sovereignty of German princes, granting them greater control over their territories and effectively dismantling the idea of a strong, centralized empire under the authority of the emperor. One of the key results of the Treaty of Westphalia was the religious division within the empire. The peace treaty recognized the Protestant Reformation's changes to the religious landscape of Europe, officially legalizing Protestantism within the Holy Roman Empire alongside Catholicism. The treaty also expanded the rights of the Calvinists, who had previously been excluded from the peace settlement. As a result, religious fragmentation within the empire was solidified, further weakening the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor, who had long been tasked with maintaining religious unity across the empire. The treaty's political provisions also had far-reaching consequences. The German princes gained unprecedented independence, allowing them to choose the religion of their territories and pursue foreign policies without the emperor's interference. The emperor, now reduced to a figurehead, could no longer command the loyalty of the various regional rulers. The idea of a unified, centralized Holy Roman Empire became increasingly unrealistic, as local autonomy and regional rivalries took precedence. France emerged as the primary beneficiary of the Treaty of Westphalia. Having supported the Protestant factions during the 30 Years' War, France secured significant territorial gains in Germany, particularly in the Rhineland and Franche-Comté. The Habsburgs, the traditional ruling family of the Holy Roman Empire, were severely weakened, with their Austrian possessions remaining intact, but their imperial power significantly diminished. The Spanish Habsburgs, who had long been a dominant force in Europe, were also struggling to maintain their influence. This new political reality had significant repercussions for the empire's future. The decline of the emperor's power led to the rise of local rulers who increasingly acted as independent authorities within their territories. The Holy Roman Empire, instead of functioning as a cohesive political entity, became a loose collection of independent states and principalities. The emperor's authority was further undermined by the growing strength of the French monarchy, which increasingly dominated European politics. The Habsburgs, under Leopold I, attempted to maintain a semblance of imperial authority. Leopold's reign, 1658 to 1705, saw the imperial court try to consolidate control over the remaining parts of the empire. However, their efforts were hampered by the rising strength of regional powers, particularly the Prussian kingdom in the north and the Bavarian duchy in the south. The emperor's power was now merely symbolic, with the true political influence resting in the hands of local rulers and the growing state apparatus of the German principalities. In addition to internal fragmentation, the Holy Roman Empire faced external challenges. The Ottoman Empire continued to threaten the empire's southeastern borders, and the French under Louis XIV sought to expand their influence at the expense of the Habsburgs. The War of Devolution, 1667 to 1668, and the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, further exposed the weaknesses of the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg monarchy in defending its territories. Following the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the Holy Roman Empire was no longer a cohesive and centralized entity. The Habsburgs, despite their long-standing claim to the imperial throne, faced mounting challenges in attempting to assert control over their vast and fragmented territories. The Treaty of Westphalia had allowed the German princes to increase their autonomy, making it increasingly difficult for the Habsburgs to maintain a unified empire. The Habsburg struggle for imperial dominance during the second half of the 17th century was complicated by both internal and external threats. One of the most significant challenges came from the rise of Prussia in the north. While the Habsburgs were focused on maintaining their influence in Austria, Bohemia, and other Central European territories, Prussia, under the leadership of the electors of Brandenburg, was gradually building its own military and political power. In 1701, Frederick I of Brandenburg declared himself King of Prussia, signaling the rise of a new power that would become one of the greatest rivals to the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs, who were traditionally the most powerful rulers in Central Europe, now found themselves facing the Prussian military machine, which was rapidly modernizing and expanding its influence. At the same time, the Habsburgs continued to face external pressure from the Ottoman Empire, which remained a constant threat in the southeastern and eastern borders of the empire. The Battle of Vienna in 1683, when Polish King Jan III Sobieski helped to lift the Ottoman siege of Vienna, was a pivotal moment in European history, marking the beginning of the decline of Ottoman power in Europe. However, the Ottoman Empire remained a formidable adversary, and the Habsburgs found themselves struggling to defend their southeastern territories while also facing the rising strength of Prussia in the north. In addition to these external threats, the Habsburgs' rule was increasingly challenged by local rulers within the empire. The Prussian electors were gaining influence, and territories like Bavaria and Saxony began to assert their independence, further fragmenting the empire. The Habsburgs' grip on Central Europe began to slip, and the growing strength of Prussia was one of the main reasons for this. The Habsburgs, despite their significant influence in Austria and parts of Italy, were now facing the possibility of being outflanked by the rising Prussian kingdom. To counterbalance these external and internal challenges, the Habsburgs focused on reinforcing their alliances with other European powers, particularly through the marriage alliances that had been a hallmark of Habsburg strategy. The marriage of Leopold I's daughter to the Spanish king in the late 17th century was a key element in consolidating Habsburg power in southern Europe, especially in Spain. These alliances helped to shore up the Habsburgs' influence, though they could not prevent the rise of Prussia and the continued fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs' struggle to retain imperial authority also involved a series of military and diplomatic challenges. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, was a critical conflict that saw the Habsburgs fight to maintain their claim to the Spanish throne after the death of the childless Charles II of Spain. Despite the eventual success of the Habsburgs in securing the throne for Charles VI, the war demonstrated that the Habsburg Empire was becoming more isolated and fragmented. By the end of the 17th century, the Habsburgs' power within the Holy Roman Empire had significantly waned, signaling the decline of the once dominant imperial authority. The Treaty of Westphalia had already established a fragmented empire, with German princes securing the right to choose their own religions and assert regional autonomy. However, the continued rise of new powers like Prussia and the ongoing threats from outside forces, especially the Ottoman Empire and France, would push the Habsburgs to adapt to a rapidly changing Europe. The Habsburgs faced a particularly daunting challenge from Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King, whose ambitious territorial expansion throughout the latter half of the 17th century posed a direct threat to the Habsburgs' territorial holdings, especially in the Low Countries, Italy, and the Rhineland. France's success in dominating much of Western Europe and challenging the Habsburgs' influence marked a shift in the balance of power in Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, would be one of the final conflicts in which the Habsburgs sought to curb French dominance, culminating in a political and military showdown over the future of the Spanish monarchy. At the heart of the War of the Spanish Succession was the issue of dynastic succession following the death of Charles II of Spain in 1700. Charles II's death without an heir left the Spanish crown in dispute between the Habsburgs and the French Bourbons. The Habsburgs, represented by Archduke Charles, later Charles VI, claimed the Spanish throne, while Louis XIV of France supported his grandson Philip V. The war that followed was fought on multiple fronts across Europe, with a coalition of powers, including Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire, fighting to prevent the unification of France and Spain under the Bourbons. The war ultimately ended in a stalemate, with the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, recognizing Philip V as the legitimate king of Spain, but with important territorial concessions to the Habsburgs. Austria gained the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, and Milan, thus extending Habsburg influence in Italy. Although the Habsburgs did not achieve their goal of uniting the Spanish and Austrian crowns, the Treaty of Utrecht marked the end of French expansion in the region and the consolidation of Habsburg power in southern Europe. Despite this limited success, the Habsburgs' imperial ambitions in Central Europe continued to decline. The Holy Roman Empire, already fragmented by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, could not be restored to its former strength. The Habsburgs had been unable to secure the loyalty of the German princes, whose influence had grown in the post-Westphalian period. The empire was now effectively reduced to a collection of semi-independent states, with the emperor's authority little more than a symbolic figurehead. As the Habsburgs turned their attention to securing their Austrian holdings and Italian territories, it became increasingly clear that the Holy Roman Empire was an antiquated and ineffective institution in the face of the growing rise of nation-states in Western Europe. The decline of the imperial system marked the beginning of a new political era in Europe, characterized by centralized monarchies and the rise of powerful national states like France, Britain, and the emerging Prussian kingdom. The Habsburgs, though still influential in European politics, were no longer the dominant imperial force they had once been. The War of the Spanish Succession had demonstrated the changing balance of power in Europe, and the Habsburg imperial decline was now a reflection of the shifting political realities of the early modern period. The Holy Roman Empire, once a unifying force in Central Europe, had entered a period of decline, and the Habsburgs were increasingly focused on maintaining their own territorial integrity rather than exercising supreme power over the empire. The War of Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, was a pivotal conflict in the 18th century, marking a significant moment in the history of the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg monarchy. The war, which erupted shortly after the death of Charles VI in 1740, revealed the growing fragility of the Habsburg dynasty and the decline of imperial power in Central Europe. It also highlighted the shifting balance of power between the European great powers, which was increasingly shaped by the emerging nation-states. Charles VI, who had ruled as Holy Roman Emperor from 1711 until his death, faced a significant challenge during his reign, securing the succession of his only daughter, Maria Theresa. With no male heirs, Charles sought to ensure that his daughter would inherit the Habsburg lands, which included the Austrian territories, Bohemia, Hungary, and the Low Countries. In 1713, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, a decree that legally recognized Maria Theresa as his heir. This was an extraordinary step, as it allowed for a woman to inherit the vast Habsburg domains, a move that was not universally accepted by European powers, many of whom still adhered to the principle of male succession. Charles VI's efforts to secure the Pragmatic Sanction were largely successful during his lifetime. However, his sudden death in 1740 left Maria Theresa in a precarious position. The Habsburg lands, though vast, were not unified under a single ruler, and the Holy Roman Empire itself was fragmented into numerous semi-independent states. Charles VI's death sparked an immediate power struggle over the future of the Habsburg domains. The most significant challenge came from Frederick II of Prussia, who sought to capitalize on the moment to seize the rich territory of Silesia from the Habsburgs. The Prussian invasion of Silesia in 1740 was the opening move of the War of Austrian Succession. Frederick II, known as Frederick the Great, argued that the Pragmatic Sanction was legally flawed and that he had a legitimate claim to Silesia. His military campaign in Silesia marked the beginning of a conflict that would see many European powers involved in a fight for territorial control, with alliances shifting rapidly between the belligerents. While Frederick's ambitions were clear, the war was not solely about Prussia's expansion. Maria Theresa, as the newly crowned Queen of Hungary and Archduchess of Austria, found herself facing a coalition of European powers eager to exploit her vulnerability. France sided with Prussia, seeing an opportunity to weaken the Austrian Habsburgs and reduce their influence in Central Europe. On the other side, Great Britain supported Maria Theresa's cause, largely because of its rivalry with France and its desire to maintain the balance of power in Europe. The Habsburg monarchy, despite being weakened by internal fragmentation, had an enormous military challenge ahead. Maria Theresa, who had little experience in ruling, was suddenly thrust into a leadership position at a time of crisis. She showed remarkable resilience, rallying her forces and working tirelessly to strengthen her position. Despite the odds, her efforts would play a key role in ensuring the survival of the Habsburg lands. The war would become not only a fight for the future of the Habsburg monarchy, but also a crucial chapter in the decline of the Holy Roman Empire, which was losing its ability to unite its territories under a single imperial authority. As the War of Austrian Succession unfolded, the initial phase of the conflict revealed the complexities of the European power struggles of the 18th century. The war, which began in 1740 with Frederick the Great's invasion of Silesia, quickly drew in multiple European powers, each with its own motivations and ambitions. The outcome of this war would not only determine the future of the Austrian Habsburgs, but also signal the decline of the Holy Roman Empire as a unified political entity. The conflict began when Prussia, under Frederick II, seized the region of Silesia, a rich and strategically important part of Austrian territory. Frederick's move was both a military and political challenge to Maria Theresa, who had ascended to the throne as the first female monarch of the Habsburg dynasty. Although she had been recognized as the legitimate heir under her father's pragmatic sanction, the Austrian succession crisis made her vulnerable. Frederick saw this as an opportunity to advance Prussia's territorial ambitions and secure his position as one of the leading powers in Central Europe. Maria Theresa, determined to protect the Austrian territories, quickly sought the support of Great Britain and the Dutch Republic. Both nations, seeing the Prussian expansion as a threat to the balance of power in Europe, pledged to support Maria Theresa in her defense of her inheritance. However, Maria Theresa faced a grave challenge in the form of the French. France, historically a rival of Austria, supported Prussia's cause, hoping to weaken the Habsburgs and gain influence in Central Europe. The early stages of the war saw a series of military engagements across Europe. Prussian forces, benefiting from their well-trained army and superior tactics, were able to make early gains in Silesia. Frederick's rapid advancement through the region caught the Austrian forces off guard. Despite being outnumbered and underprepared, Frederick's forces captured several key Silesian cities, including Breslau, modern-day Wrocław, and by the end of 1741, Prussia had firmly entrenched itself in the region. However, Maria Theresa was not defeated. Despite losing Silesia, she rallied a coalition of European powers to counteract Prussia's expansion. Austria, Britain, and the Dutch Republic began to collaborate on a military campaign to push back against Frederick's forces, seeking to undermine the Prussian gains. Meanwhile, France continued to support Prussia, further complicating the European dynamics. The French intervention added another layer of complexity to the war, with France's interest in weakening the Habsburgs often superseding its commitment to Prussia's territorial ambitions. The war also had significant consequences for the Holy Roman Empire itself. As the conflict escalated, the Habsburgs increasingly turned to their allies in Britain and the Dutch Republic for military support, while the German princes, who traditionally owed allegiance to the emperor, showed little willingness to intervene in the conflict. The lack of unity within the Holy Roman Empire was becoming more apparent, as the imperial authority was undermined by the competing interests of the German states. Throughout the war, the Habsburg monarchy's position became progressively weaker. The empire's inability to unite its territories under a single banner, combined with the growing independence of the German princes, highlighted the declining influence of the Holy Roman Emperor. Maria Theresa's struggle for her inheritance was not just a battle for the Austrian crown. It was also a contest over the future of a fragmented empire, the treaty primarily reaffirmed the territorial status quo. Maria Theresa was recognized as the legitimate ruler of the Austrian lands, and her reign was thus secured. However, she was forced to cede Silesia to Prussia, which had been the initial catalyst of the war. Silesia, a rich and strategically important region, became part of Prussia's territorial gains, cementing Frederick the Great's position as one of the dominant monarchs in Europe. For Frederick, the treaty was a diplomatic victory, as it not only recognized his conquest of Silesia, but also established Prussia as a powerful European state with a military prowess that would shape the continent for years to come. For the Habsburgs, the loss of Silesia was a major blow, but it also marked a critical turning point. Despite this territorial loss, Maria Theresa's resilience during the war helped solidify her reputation as a strong and capable ruler. The Austrian monarchy was forced to turn its attention toward reforming and rebuilding after the war, focusing on strengthening its military and governance structures. While the Habsburgs had lost significant territory, they managed to retain much of their influence in Central Europe, including Bohemia, Hungary, and other key territories. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle also revealed the shifting nature of European diplomacy. Great Britain and France, who had supported opposing sides during the conflict, reached a compromise at the treaty's conclusion, effectively ending the European theater of the war. For Britain, The treaty was an opportunity to solidify its control over colonial territories, particularly in North America and India, at the expense of French interests. France, by contrast, had to accept its losses in the colonial realm but managed to retain some influence in European politics. Despite the treaty's efforts to restore peace, it did little to resolve the deep-rooted rivalries and tensions that had led to the war. The Habsburgs still harbored a desire to reclaim Silesia, and Prussia's military dominance would continue to challenge Austrian authority in the coming decades. Meanwhile, the French, though temporarily exhausted from their losses, remained a powerful force in Europe and would soon become involved in other global conflicts, particularly in North America during the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. The treaty also had lasting implications for the Holy Roman Empire. While it temporarily stabilized the empire's internal politics, it further emphasized the imperial decline. The German princes had increasingly asserted their independence, and the emperor's authority had been significantly diminished. The Habsburgs remained emperors, but their control over the empire was limited. The Holy Roman Empire, as an institution, was becoming increasingly irrelevant in the context of the growing nation-state system, where sovereign monarchs with centralized power were gaining influence across Europe. The War of Austrian Succession and the subsequent Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 reshaped the political dynamics of Central Europe, particularly in relation to the Habsburgs and the Kingdom of Prussia. While Maria Theresa had managed to hold on to much of her Austrian inheritance, the war and its aftermath exposed the growing military might and political influence of Prussia, which was becoming a dominant force in European affairs. The loss of Silesia to Prussia in the war marked a significant shift in the balance of power in Central Europe, and the rivalry between the Habsburgs and Prussia would continue to shape the region for decades. Frederick the Great, who had led Prussia to victory in the war, emerged as a powerful figure in European politics. After his triumph in the war, he sought to further consolidate Prussia's power and expand its territories. His aggressive policies and military campaigns made Prussia a major military power in Europe, capable of challenging even the largest empires. Frederick's success in Silesia not only enhanced Prussia's territorial holdings, but also its prestige, marking the kingdom as a serious rival to the Habsburgs. In response to this new threat, Maria Theresa focused her efforts on rebuilding and modernizing the Habsburg military. Despite the loss of Silesia, Maria Theresa recognized the need to secure her remaining territories and strengthen her position in the empire. She implemented military reforms and worked to enhance her alliances with other European powers. One of the key aspects of her strategy was to ensure that Austria could hold its own against Prussia without the constant need for external assistance. One of Maria Theresa's most significant moves was to seek the support of France, traditionally an enemy of the Habsburgs. The Franco-Austrian alliance that emerged in the mid-18th century was a remarkable shift in European diplomacy. Historically, France had been the Habsburgs' principal rival, but the mutual interest in curbing Prussian expansion led to a dramatic realignment of power in Europe. This shift in alliances would have significant ramifications for the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, where the Franco-Austrian alliance would prove crucial in countering the Prussian and British forces. However, despite Maria Theresa's efforts to secure her position, the Prussian threat continued to loom large. The Habsburg monarchy, though resilient, had been severely weakened by its inability to regain Silesia. Frederick's Prussian kingdom was not only militarily superior, but also strategically positioned in a way that made it difficult for the Habsburgs to challenge it directly. Prussia's focus on military innovation and efficient governance made it a model for other European states, especially in terms of creating a strong, centralized state capable of responding rapidly to external threats. In addition to these military and political challenges, the Holy Roman Empire was struggling to maintain its unity. The empire's decentralized nature, where German princes held significant power over their own territories, meant that the emperor's authority continued to be limited. The Habsburgs, as emperors, were in a position of diminished power, unable to impose their will on the myriad of semi-independent states within the empire. The Prussian rise further exacerbated this, as Frederick II's ambitions clashed with the remaining influence of the Habsburgs. By the mid-18th century, the once dominant Holy Roman Empire was increasingly a loose confederation of states. The Habsburgs, while still holding significant power, were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain control over their empire. The rise of Prussia as a military and political power, along with the growing influence of France and Britain, signaled the decline of the Holy Roman Empire as a unified political entity. This would lead to a shifting balance of power in Europe, one that would continue to evolve in the coming decades, ultimately contributing to the empire's collapse in the 19th century. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, was a conflict of global significance, shaping the future of Europe and the Habsburg monarchy. Although it began as a continuation of the struggle over Silesia, the rich and strategically crucial province lost to Prussia during the War of Austrian Succession, it quickly expanded into a wider European war involving most of the major powers of the time. For the Habsburgs, the war was an opportunity to reclaim Silesia and to reassert their power in the face of Prussian aggression, which had already weakened their position in the Holy Roman Empire. The conflict began with Frederick the Great of Prussia launching a preemptive strike against Austria. Fearing that Maria Theresa would use the peace from the War of Austrian Succession to strengthen her position and regain Silesia, Frederick invaded the region in 1756. His swift attack caught the Austrian military unprepared, and Prussia's early victories in the war reinforced the idea that Prussia was now a major European military power. Maria Theresa, who had already experienced the humiliation of losing Silesia to Frederick in the previous war, was determined not to let it go without a fight. She sought to form a new coalition of allies to oppose Prussia and reclaim her lost territories. Her key allies in the conflict were France and Russia, both of whom had interests in weakening Prussia. France, which had long been a rival to Britain and had already allied with Austria in the previous war, saw this as an opportunity to diminish the power of Prussia, which had established itself as a significant threat to French influence in Europe. Russia, under Empress Elizabeth, was also eager to check Prussian power and support the Habsburgs in their quest for territorial restoration. Russia's involvement in the war allowed Maria Theresa to maintain a strong front against Frederick, even though the Austrians were still militarily inferior in comparison to Prussia. The Habsburg-Russian alliance proved to be one of the most important factors in the struggle for Silesia and was instrumental in forcing Frederick into a prolonged war on multiple fronts. The war, however, was not only a struggle for territory, but also one for European dominance. On the other side of the conflict, Britain supported Prussia, primarily due to its rivalry with France over colonial possessions. The British were keen to weaken France and its influence in Europe, while simultaneously ensuring Prussia's military strength as a counterbalance to French power. This colonial rivalry between Britain and France also played out on other continents, notably in India and North America, where the war is often considered the French and Indian War in the American context. The 7 Years' War proved to be a costly conflict for all parties involved. The Habsburgs were able to regain some of their lost ground, but the war ultimately ended in a stalemate. In the Treaty of Hubertusburg, 1763, Frederick the Great managed to retain Silesia, effectively solidifying Prussia's status as a major European power. Although Maria Theresa failed to reclaim Silesia, her resilience in the face of Prussian aggression was widely admired, and she succeeded in maintaining the integrity of the Austrian lands. Despite losing Silesia, the Habsburgs managed to preserve their influence in Central Europe. The war also marked a shift in the balance of power in Europe. Prussia, now a key player on the European stage, had demonstrated its military capabilities and secured its position as a rival to the Habsburgs and other great powers. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, which ended the war between Britain and France, further illustrated the decline of the Habsburgs' imperial authority, as both France and Austria had lost significant territory in the aftermath of the conflict. For the Holy Roman Empire, the 7 Years' War highlighted the continuing fragmentation of imperial authority. While the Habsburgs had managed to preserve their position, their role as imperial leaders was increasingly symbolic. The empire itself had become little more than a loose confederation of independent states, with the Habsburg emperor serving as a figurehead rather than a centralizing power. The declining authority of the Holy Roman Emperor would continue into the next century, setting the stage for the eventual dissolution of the empire in 1806. The turn of the 19th century was a period of profound transformation for Europe, particularly for the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg monarchy. The French Revolution, 1789, had ignited a wave of radical political change across Europe, challenging traditional monarchies and established social orders. In the midst of this turmoil, Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power in France, quickly becoming one of the most influential figures in European history. His rise and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars would lead to the eventual end of the Holy Roman Empire and mark the decline of the Habsburgs' imperial authority. At the time of Napoleon's rise, the Holy Roman Empire was a deeply fragmented and weakening institution. The Habsburgs, under Emperor Francis II, still held the title of Holy Roman Emperor, but their power had become largely symbolic. The empire itself had long been divided into a patchwork of independent states and principalities, each with its own ruler, military, and political interests. The emperor, while still holding the prestigious title, lacked the centralized power that earlier emperors had wielded. The Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, and the War of Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, had already contributed to the empire's fragmentation, and the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, further highlighted its inability to unite the disparate states under a single authority. Napoleon's rise was both a reflection of and a reaction to the instability within Europe. His military genius and political acumen allowed him to overturn the existing power structures, starting with the French Revolution and later expanding into Europe. After seizing power in France in 1799, Napoleon sought to spread the ideals of the Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, across the continent. His expansionist ambitions brought him into direct conflict with the Habsburgs, who, as leaders of the Holy Roman Empire, found themselves on the defensive as Napoleon's armies systematically dismantled the old European order. Napoleon's military victories against Austria and its allies during the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, dramatically reshaped the balance of power in Europe. Austria, once a central player in European politics, was consistently defeated by Napoleon's forces. The War of the Third Coalition, 1805, saw a decisive victory for Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz, where he decisively defeated the Russian and Austrian armies. This victory marked the beginning of a series of humiliating defeats for the Habsburgs, further eroding their imperial authority. Napoleon's success on the battlefield allowed him to establish client states across Europe, directly undermining the Holy Roman Empire. In 1806, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, a coalition of German states that effectively broke away from the Holy Roman Empire and placed them under French influence. This confederation included many of the most powerful German principalities, such as Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg, which had previously been part of the empire. The formation of the Confederation of the Rhine was a direct challenge to the Habsburgs and a clear sign that the Holy Roman Empire could no longer function as a unified political entity. The Habsburgs, led by Emperor Francis II, were forced to recognize the reality of their weakened position. After the Treaty of Pressburg, 1805, which forced Austria to cede significant territories to Napoleon, Francis was faced with the choice of either submitting to Napoleon's rule or abandoning the title of Holy Roman Emperor altogether. In 1806, with the empire effectively dissolved and its power shattered by Napoleon's influence, Francis II made the momentous decision to resign as Holy Roman Emperor and to focus on ruling the Austrian Empire, which he had already established in 1804. By 1806, the dominance of the Holy Roman Empire was no longer sustainable. The relentless expansion of Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire, combined with the internal fragmentation of the empire, led to the formal dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, a process that marked the end of a millennium of imperial history. This marked the final blow to the Habsburgs' imperial ambitions, which had been a defining feature of Central European politics for centuries. After the formation of the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806, which effectively severed many of the German states from the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Francis II of the Habsburgs made the momentous decision to formally dissolve the Holy Roman Empire. On August 6, 1806, Francis II officially abdicated the title of Holy Roman Emperor ending the political structure that had lasted since the Middle Ages. The move was largely symbolic, as the power of the Holy Roman Emperor had already been eroded by centuries of political fragmentation. With Napoleon's influence growing and the empire no longer able to maintain its unity, the decision to end the empire marked a dramatic shift in European political and diplomatic history. For Francis, too, this move was not a surrender of power, but rather a practical response to the changing political landscape. Instead of clinging to the title of Holy Roman Emperor, he chose to reorganize and consolidate his power within his own Austrian Empire, which had been established in 1804. The Austrian Empire became the cornerstone of the Habsburgs' continued influence in Europe, even as their imperial title within the Holy Roman Empire came to an end. The creation of the Austrian Empire was also a direct response to the Napoleonic threat and an effort to preserve Austrian influence in Central Europe, especially as Napoleon's French Empire reshaped European borders. In the wake of the empire's dissolution, the Habsburg monarchy sought to rebuild and strengthen its position within the new European order. Although the Holy Roman Empire was no more, the Habsburgs retained control of significant territories, including Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and parts of Italy. Their ability to adapt to the changing political landscape, particularly in the face of Napoleon's conquests, ensured their survival as a dominant power in Central Europe. While Napoleon's reign dramatically altered the political dynamics of Europe, it was also a time of cultural, economic, and social upheaval. The Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution had spread ideas of liberalism and nationalism, which would continue to challenge the traditional monarchies and empires of Europe. The Habsburg monarchy would have to contend with these forces, even as they attempted to preserve their power in a newly shaped Europe. The Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, which convened after Napoleon's defeat, played a key role in redrawing Europe's borders and establishing a new European order. But the Habsburgs would have to adapt to a world that was rapidly moving away from the traditional imperial structure for the Holy Roman Empire. The end was inevitable given the fragmented nature of its political structure and the rising dominance of Napoleon. However, its dissolution also marked the end of an era. The Habsburgs would now focus on their Austrian Empire, which would survive Napoleon's downfall and continue to play a prominent role in European politics throughout the 19th century. The Habsburgs' transition from the Holy Roman Empire to the Austrian Empire was symbolic of the decline of medieval structures and the rise of modern nation-states. The Napoleonic era had definitively marked the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, and Europe would never return to the fragmented, imperial system that had characterized the Middle Ages. The rise of nationalism and secular power would continue to challenge the Habsburgs, who would struggle to maintain their influence as the Austrian Empire navigated the challenges of the 19th century. The Holy Roman Empire, despite its dissolution in 1806, left behind a lasting legacy that shaped not only the course of European history, but also the very structure of modern European politics and culture. For over 1,000 years, the Holy Roman Empire was central to European affairs, particularly in Central Europe, where it influenced the development of political institutions, culture, and society. Even after its formal end, the imperial legacy continued to impact the Austrian Empire, Germany, and the broader European continent. One of the most significant aspects of the Holy Roman Empire's legacy was its political structure. While the empire itself was often characterized by its fragmentation, the concept of a unified European realm under a single ruler endured for centuries. The empire was never a highly centralized state, but it played a key role in uniting a vast array of German-speaking regions, Italian territories, and Bohemia under a nominally shared authority. The Habsburg dynasty, as emperors, represented an imperial continuity, even as the political reality on the ground reflected a loose confederation of states. This decentralized system of governance left a complex legacy in Europe, particularly in the rise of the nation-state. The German-speaking territories, which had once been unified under the Holy Roman Empire, became the focus of efforts to create a unified Germany. The legacy of imperial fragmentation would continue to influence the German Confederation, 1815 to 1866, and, ultimately, the unification of Germany in the 19th century under Otto von Bismarck. The experience of centralization versus decentralization that was exemplified by the empire played a role in the shaping of modern Europe, as German-speaking states sought unity and identity after the empire's collapse. The Austrian Habsburgs, having lost their imperial title, continued to wield significant influence in Central Europe through their Austrian Empire. The Habsburg monarchy retained power in Austria, Hungary, and other regions, shaping the political and cultural future of these areas. The imperial heritage, while no longer directly associated with the Holy Roman Empire, was deeply rooted in the Habsburgs' governance, particularly in their emphasis on multinationalism and religious tolerance, a legacy of their time as emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. The Austrian Empire itself, though a product of the Napoleonic era, continued to maintain a Central European identity that owed much to its imperial past. Culturally, the Holy Roman Empire's legacy also endured, particularly in the arts, architecture, and intellectual movements. The empire's long history was marked by a diverse mix of cultural influences, from the Renaissance in Italy to the Baroque style in Central Europe. The Holy Roman Emperors were often patrons of the arts, commissioning works that blended German, Italian, and Bohemian traditions. Cities like Vienna, Prague, and Munich flourished as cultural centers during the empire's height, and their architectural, artistic, and intellectual contributions left a lasting mark on European culture. Additionally, the legal systems and philosophical traditions developed under the Holy Roman Empire had far-reaching consequences. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundation of Roman law, continued to influence legal systems in the territories of the empire. The Habsburgs, in particular, contributed to the development of Austrian civil law, which would have a lasting impact on legal codes in Central Europe. Furthermore, the empire's intellectual legacy was seen in the work of notable thinkers such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Immanuel Kant, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, whose works were influenced by the intellectual currents of the empire. The Holy Roman Empire's legacy was also felt in its role as a cultural bridge between different parts of Europe, from the Catholic Church's influence on the empire's rulers to its position as a key player in European diplomacy. The imperial role in mediating between competing European powers, whether through treaties or negotiations, continued in the post-imperial world and played a key role in shaping the diplomacy of the 19th century. The Holy Roman Empire was not only a political and cultural force, but also a significant religious and social entity that shaped the evolution of Christianity in Europe. The complex relationship between church and state in the Holy Roman Empire, and its profound impact on the Catholic Church and Protestant Reformation, had lasting effects on both religious practice and social order throughout Central Europe and beyond. The religious legacy of the Holy Roman Empire was as important as its political structure, influencing religious divisions, governance, and the development of European society. At the height of its power, the Holy Roman Empire was a major player in the Catholic Church's authority across Europe. The emperors held a unique position as both political rulers and protectors of the Church within the empire. This close relationship between the emperor and the pope, often marked by cooperation and conflict, shaped European politics for centuries. Emperors such as Charlemagne and later Frederick II were crucial in defending the papacy's position and promoting Christian unity under the auspices of the Church. The Holy Roman Empire was a theocratic institution where religion and politics intertwined, making the emperor not just a ruler, but also a guardian of the Christian faith in the Western world. However, this unity was eventually challenged by the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, which led to the religious fragmentation of the empire. Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 sparked the Protestant Reformation, which deeply affected the religious landscape of the Holy Roman Empire. Luther's criticism of the Catholic Church's practices, particularly the sale of indulgences, resonated with many German-speaking communities, leading to a profound shift in religious beliefs. As Protestantism spread throughout the empire, the Catholic Church's dominance was threatened, and the empire itself became divided between Catholic and Protestant factions, particularly after the Treaty of Augsburg, 1555, which allowed rulers to choose between Catholicism and Lutheranism in their territories. The religious wars that followed, notably the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, were a direct result of the religious divisions within the Holy Roman Empire. This war, fought primarily between Catholic and Protestant factions, decimated large portions of the empire, and led to the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, which officially recognized Protestantism and Catholicism as coexisting faiths within the empire. While the treaty brought an end to the fighting, it also signified the permanent religious fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire, as different territories and principalities followed their rulers' religious choices. This fragmentation set the stage for a Europe divided along religious lines, with both Catholicism and Protestantism continuing to influence the social and political development of the continent. On a social level, the Holy Roman Empire had a profound effect on the structure of society, particularly in the German states. The empire was a hierarchical system where power was often decentralized and spread across various noble families, bishops, and princes. Feudalism was the dominant social structure, with the emperor at the top, followed by the noble classes, clergy, and peasants. The empire's social order remained largely medieval, with rigid class distinctions and limited social mobility. However, as the empire fragmented, this social structure began to change. The Reformation and the subsequent Enlightenment brought about new ideas about individual rights and governance. Protestant regions, in particular, emphasized the importance of education, individual conscience, and work ethic, which gradually led to a shift in the social fabric of the empire. This focus on education, which was particularly strong in Protestant territories, laid the foundation for the development of the public education system that would spread across Europe in the centuries to follow. The Holy Roman Empire's religious legacy was also felt through the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which was a direct response to the rise of Protestantism. Led by figures like Pope Paul III and the Jesuit order, the Catholic Church sought to reaffirm its authority and combat Protestant ideas through religious reforms and missionary activities. The Counter-Reformation was particularly influential in Central Europe, where Catholicism was often seen as a unifying force in the face of Protestantism's spread. The Jesuit order, in particular, played a central role in promoting Catholic education, missionary work, and the suppression of Protestant teachings. The Holy Roman Empire, despite its eventual dissolution in 1806, left behind a rich intellectual and economic legacy that continued to shape Europe long after its collapse. From its philosophical contributions to its economic systems, the empire's influence was felt across Germany, Austria, and other parts of Central Europe, where it laid the foundations for many of the cultural and economic practices that would define the modern European state. One of the most enduring contributions of the Holy Roman Empire was its role in philosophy and the Enlightenment. The empire was home to some of the most influential philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries, many of whom contributed to the intellectual climate that would reshape European thought. Immanuel Kant, perhaps the most famous philosopher associated with the region, developed his critical philosophy in the context of the empire. Kant's ideas on ethics, metaphysics, and the nature of knowledge were fundamental to the development of modern philosophy, particularly in the areas of epistemology and moral theory. In addition to Kant, other influential figures such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Friedrich Schiller contributed to the cultural and intellectual vitality of the empire. Goethe's works, especially his famous play Faust, were not only central to the German literary tradition, but also explored themes of human nature, freedom, and the quest for knowledge. These intellectual movements, particularly within German-speaking regions of the former Holy Roman Empire, laid the groundwork for the broader European Enlightenment, which promoted reason, individual rights, and the pursuit of scientific knowledge. The Holy Roman Empire also contributed to the evolution of modern economics. The empire's trade networks, which stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, played a significant role in the development of capitalist economies in Central Europe. The Hanseatic League, which operated within the empire, was a powerful trading alliance that dominated northern European trade from the 14th to the 17th century. While the Hanseatic League existed before the empire's dissolution, its influence extended into the 18th century, laying the foundations for the development of capitalist market economies in the region. Additionally, the Habsburgs contributed to the economic modernization of their territories, particularly in Austria and Hungary. Francis II, after the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, focused on economic reform within the Austrian Empire, creating a more centralized economy that promoted agriculture, industry, and infrastructure development. This process contributed to the rise of industrialization in the 19th century, which would later spread throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Another important economic legacy of the Holy Roman Empire was its influence on banking and finance. Cities such as Venice, Nuremberg, and Augsburg became centers of trade and finance within the empire. Augsburg, in particular, was home to the Fugger family, one of the wealthiest banking families in Europe during the 16th century. The Fuggers played a key role in financing European trade, loans to monarchs, and capitalizing industrial ventures, helping to develop the financial structures that would later be integral to the growth of Europe's capitalist economy. Furthermore, the empire's decentralized structure allowed for the development of local economic policies that could be tailored to individual territories. While this decentralized approach often hindered political unity, it allowed different regions to foster economic specialization, leading to the development of different industries in different parts of the empire. Regions like Bohemia were known for their mining and metal industries, while southern Germany became an important center for craftsmanship and trade. These economic practices continued to influence the German-speaking territories long after the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed exploring history with us, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more captivating stories. At Pass to Pillow, we bring history to life, making it the perfect companion for a restful sleep. Drop your thoughts or suggestions below.